Have you ever wondered about the whispers of a forgotten people? A group whose very name evokes images of darkness and mystery, yet who shaped the destiny of an entire continent. Imagine a time when vast empires crumbled not just from within, but under the relentless pressure of newcomers, moving across plains and rivers, driven by forces we still don't fully comprehend. It's a strange fact of history, isn't it? How the mightiest structures can be brought low by those considered barbarians. Their stories often told by the very people they challenged, leaving us with tantalizing gaps and conflicting accounts. We call them the Goths, and their journey is a tapestry woven with threads of migration, conflict, and a surprising amount of cultural exchange. A narrative that has rippled through centuries, even influencing the very words we use today. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. The story of the Goths, a people whose very identity remains a subject of considerable scholarly debate, begins not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate migration from the cold northern lands of Scandinavia. While the exact departure point and the precise routes they took are still debated among historians, the consensus points to a gradual movement across the Baltic Sea, eventually landing them on the southern shores, what we now know as northern Poland. This initial migration, likely spanning generations, was less a sudden invasion and more a series of incremental shifts, driven perhaps by population pressures, environmental changes, or the allure of richer lands. They weren't a monolithic entity, arriving fully formed, but rather a collection of related tribal groups, bound by similar customs, language, and a shared, albeit often mythical, understanding of their common ancestry. Think of it less as a grand organized march, and more like a series of smaller families and clans picking up stakes, one after another, heading south to see what was over the next hill, or rather, across the next body of water. Now, exactly when this grand exodus began is one of those wonderfully frustrating historical mysteries. Classical sources, particularly the 6th century historian Jordanes, in his work Getica, provide the most detailed, if somewhat embellished, account linking the Goths to the island of Skansa, our modern Scandinavia. Jordanes, writing centuries after the fact and relying on earlier, now lost works, paints a vivid picture of their origins. Yet his narrative is often infused with the desire to glorify his Gothic heritage, leading to some understandable skepticism among modern scholars. Was it a mass migration driven by a charismatic leader named Berig, as Jordanes suggests, or a more organic process of expansion and fissioning? The archaeological record offers tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers, leaving historians to piece together the puzzle from pottery shards, burial practices, and scattered mentions in Roman texts. It's a bit like trying to reconstruct a complex novel from a few torn pages and a dust jacket. You get the gist, but the nuances are often lost to time. As these proto-Gothic groups settled along the southern Baltic coast, they established what archaeologists identify as the wheelbark culture. This culture, characterized by its distinctive material remains, particularly its burial traditions, which often included unburnt bodies and a relative scarcity of weapons in graves compared to neighboring cultures, suggests a degree of social and economic development. The absence of extensive weaponry in burial contexts has led some to theorize a less overtly militaristic society than later Gothic groups, or perhaps simply a different set of funerary customs. They were, in essence, putting down roots, farming, trading, and interacting with the various peoples already inhabiting these lands. This wasn't a static period. There was a dynamic interplay of cultures, an exchange of ideas and goods that would subtly shape the Gothic identity over generations. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? A powerful, later feared, people starting out in such a seemingly peaceful manner, slowly finding their footing in a new land. Their journey continued, a westward and southward drift along the Vistula River, bringing them into contact with other Germanic tribes, and eventually, the vast and ever-present shadow of the Roman Empire. This move, sometimes referred to as the Gothic Long March, saw them traversing vast distances, adapting to new environments, and absorbing elements from the cultures they encountered. It's a classic case of cultural osmosis, where influences flow in multiple directions, transforming both the newcomers and the existing inhabitants. We don't have detailed travel logs, obviously, but we can infer much from the shifting archaeological horizons and the later accounts of Roman historians who, for the first time, began to truly notice these burgeoning northern powers. Imagine trying to navigate through unknown territories, with only the stars and perhaps the whispers of distant trade routes to guide you, gradually pushing into lands that would eventually become synonymous with their name. This period of sustained movement, stretching over a century or more, instilled in the Goths a certain adaptability and resilience, qualities that would serve them well in the turbulent centuries to come. They were, in essence, becoming a people on the move, a characteristic that would define much of their subsequent history. The very name Goth itself presents another fascinating mystery, a linguistic puzzle without a definitive solution. While generally accepted to be an endonym, meaning a name they used for themselves, its precise etymology is debated. Some scholars link it to words meaning people or men, while others suggest a connection to terms implying to pour or to be poured, perhaps referencing their migrations or even their martial prowess. What's clear is that the Romans, our primary source of information, were hearing a name that sounded like Gothi or Gothones, and they began to apply it to the various groups they encountered who shared similar characteristics. It's a bit like how we might broadly categorize a group of people today based on a shared trait, even if their internal distinctions are far more nuanced. So when we talk about the Goths, we're often talking about a Roman perception of a diverse group, rather than a single, perfectly unified entity. This inherent ambiguity in their naming underscores the challenge of understanding ancient peoples primarily through the lens of their adversaries or neighbors. The slow, inexorable movement of the Goths continued, a sprawling demographic wave that inevitably brought them to the very doorstep of the Roman Empire. An encounter that would forever alter the course of European history. It wasn't a sudden clash, but rather a series of gradual interactions, starting with trade and diplomacy along the vast Roman frontier, stretching from the Rhine to the Danube. Initially, these encounters were relatively peaceful, an exchange of goods and ideas across borders that were more porous than later narratives might suggest. The Romans, ever pragmatic, saw opportunities for commerce, acquiring furs, amber, and other raw materials from the northern barbarians, while the Goths, in turn, gained access to Roman manufactured goods, luxury items, and perhaps most importantly, a glimpse into a world of sophisticated organization and wealth. This period, often overlooked in the grander narratives of conflict, was crucial for both sides, as it fostered a degree of familiarity, however superficial, before the inevitable storm clouds gathered. It's almost quaint to imagine, isn't it? These future antagonists initially engaged in what amounted to cross-border shopping. However, beneath this veneer of tentative cooperation, tensions simmered. The Roman Empire, for all its might, was a sprawling, bureaucratic behemoth, constantly seeking to assert control over its periphery. As the Goths pressed closer to the Roman provinces, particularly Dacia, a region rich in resources and strategically important, the nature of their interactions began to shift. What started as trade slowly morphed into a more complex dynamic, involving tribute payments, occasional skirmishes, and the enlistment of Gothic warriors as auxiliary troops in the Roman legions. This practice of integrating barbarian fighters into the Roman military was a double-edged sword. It provided much-needed manpower, but it also exposed these groups to Roman military tactics and organizational structures, inadvertently training future adversaries. It's one of those historical ironies, isn't it, where the very act of self-preservation sows the seeds of future destruction. By the mid-3rd century AD, the relationship between the Goths and Rome had deteriorated significantly, escalating from border incidents to full-scale conflict. The Goths, now a more formidable and cohesive force, began launching large-scale raids across the Danube, targeting Roman cities and towns in Dacia, Moesia, and Thrace. These weren't just opportunistic smash-and-grab operations. They were increasingly organized campaigns, led by ambitious Gothic chieftains who saw the Roman provinces not just as sources of plunder, but as potential new territories. The Roman Empire, simultaneously grappling with internal political instability, economic crises, and other barbarian incursions along its vast borders, found itself increasingly stretched thin. It was a perfect storm, really, where the barbarians were growing stronger and more audacious, while the empire was experiencing a period of significant internal weakness, often referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century. One of the earliest and most devastating blows came in 251 AD, when the Goths, under their king Cniva, inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Romans at the Battle of Abritus. This battle is particularly infamous because it resulted in the death of the Roman Emperor Decius and his son Herennius Etruscus. Imagine that, a sitting Roman emperor dying in battle against a barbarian foe. It was an absolutely shocking event for the Romans, an unprecedented humiliation that reverberated throughout the empire and shattered the illusion of Roman invincibility. It was a stark wake-up call, a brutal demonstration that these barbarians were not just a nuisance, but a genuine existential threat. The Goths, on the other hand, gained immense prestige and confidence from this victory, seeing it as validation of their growing power and a sign of Roman weakness. Following this devastating defeat, the Goths continued their plundering expeditions, pushing deeper into Roman territory. They even embarked on naval raids across the Black Sea, striking at wealthy cities in Asia Minor and the Aegean, including the sacking of Ephesus and its renowned Temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. These maritime ventures demonstrate a remarkable adaptability and resourcefulness on the part of the Goths, who were, after all, primarily a land-based people. They quickly learned to construct or appropriate ships, transforming themselves into formidable seaborne raiders, adding another layer of complexity to the Roman defense strategy. It just goes to show you, when people are motivated, they can learn new tricks pretty fast, even if those tricks involve sailing unfamiliar seas to loot ancient temples. The Roman response to these escalating Gothic threats was often a mix of military action and diplomatic maneuvering. Emperors like Claudius Gothicus, who earned his epithet for his victories over the Goths, and Aurelian managed to stem the tide temporarily, achieving significant military successes and pushing the Goths back across the Danube. These emperors understood that decisive military action was necessary, but they also recognized the practical limitations of endlessly fighting a determined and numerous foe. Sometimes pragmatic concessions were made, including agreements to allow certain Gothic groups to settle within Roman territory as foederati or allies, in exchange for military service. This policy, while seemingly sensible on the surface, laid the groundwork for future problems, as it effectively brought large, armed, and often independent-minded Gothic contingents deeper into the heart of the empire, creating internal pressures that would eventually erupt. One of the great historiographical mysteries of this period concerns the precise nature of Gothic social and political organization during these early interactions. Were they truly a unified nation under powerful kings, or were they a looser confederation of tribes who coalesced for raiding purposes? Roman sources often portray them as a unified enemy, but this might have been more a reflection of Roman administrative convenience than a precise anthropological reality. The truth is likely somewhere in between. Powerful chieftains could rally significant numbers for specific campaigns, but long-term, centralized control over all Gothic factions was probably elusive. This internal dynamic, the shifting allegiances and rivalries among different Gothic groups, is a fascinating and often frustrating aspect for historians, as it adds layers of complexity to an already turbulent period. Understanding this internal fluidity helps us comprehend why Gothic behavior could seem inconsistent from a Roman perspective. Despite periods of Roman resurgence and temporary victories, the Gothic pressure on the empire's borders continued relentlessly, marking a new, more aggressive phase of their interactions. It wasn't just about localized raids anymore. The Goths were becoming a persistent, destabilizing force, their presence a constant source of anxiety for Roman administrators and frontier garrisons. The sheer scale of their movements and the increasing frequency of their incursions began to stretch Roman resources to their breaking point. Imagine trying to guard an impossibly long fence, constantly being probed and pushed at multiple weak points, all while dealing with your own internal squabbles and financial woes. That was the Roman reality as the 3rd century gave way to the 4th. One particularly striking aspect of these Gothic incursions was their adaptability. They didn't just rely on brute force. They learned from their encounters, refining their tactics, and even adopting Roman military equipment when possible. While often portrayed as unsophisticated barbarians, the Goths demonstrated a pragmatic willingness to learn and evolve. They were effective raiders, swift in their movements, striking vulnerable targets before disappearing back across the frontier, carrying off plunder and captives. This hit-and-run strategy was incredibly difficult for the Romans to counter, as it required constant vigilance and rapid deployment of forces across vast distances. It's almost like trying to swat a particularly agile mosquito in a very large room, isn't it? The strategic focus of these Gothic raids often centered on the rich provinces south of the Danube, particularly Moesia and Thrace. These regions, fertile and dotted with prosperous Roman cities, were tempting targets. The Goths would sweep through, bypassing heavily fortified strongholds where possible, and concentrate on acquiring loot and prisoners. These captives were valuable, either for ransom or as forced labor, adding another dimension to the Gothic economic model. The raids weren't just about sustenance. They were about accumulating wealth and prestige within Gothic society, reinforcing the power of successful chieftains and warriors. This constant drain on Roman resources, both human and material, began to exact a heavy toll on the economic stability and demographic balance of the frontier provinces. As the 4th century progressed, the term Goths in Roman sources began to distinguish between two main groups: the Visigoths, Western Goths, and the Ostrogoths, Eastern Goths. While these distinctions weren't always clear-cut at the time, and their identities would evolve significantly, it reflects a growing awareness within the Roman Empire of different Gothic factions operating in distinct geographical areas. The Visigoths were generally more active in the regions immediately north of the lower Danube, while the Ostrogoths were often associated with lands further east, around the Black Sea and the vast Pontic steppe. This geographical separation, driven by the sheer scale of Gothic expansion, would eventually lead to divergent historical paths and distinct political entities. It's like two branches of a family tree growing in different directions, influenced by different environments and neighbors. The Romans, under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine the Great, implemented significant reforms aimed at strengthening the empire's defenses and internal stability. Diocletian's tetrarchy and Constantine's foundation of Constantinople as a new capital in the east were, in part, responses to these persistent barbarian pressures, including those from the Goths. Fortifications were reinforced, military organization was restructured, and new legions were raised. Yet even with these efforts, the sheer numbers and relentless determination of the Goths remained a formidable challenge. There's a subtle debate among historians about whether these Roman reforms were genuinely effective in stemming the tide, or merely slowed down the inevitable. It's a bit like fixing a leaky roof, only to find the entire foundation is slowly crumbling. One fascinating, yet often overlooked aspect of this period is the role of Christianity in the Gothic world. While the majority of the Roman Empire was embracing Nicene Christianity, many Goths, particularly those in closer contact with Roman missionaries, adopted Arian Christianity, this distinct theological interpretation which held that Jesus was created by God the Father and therefore subordinate to him, contrasted sharply with the Nicene belief in the co-equality of the Trinity. The most famous figure in this regard was Ulfilas, a Gothic bishop who lived in the 4th century. He is credited with translating the Bible into the Gothic language, and in doing so, creating the Gothic alphabet. This monumental achievement not only facilitated the spread of Arian Christianity among the Goths, but also provides invaluable linguistic evidence for a language that would otherwise be lost to us. This religious difference would become a significant point of tension in later interactions with the Nicene Roman Empire, adding a theological layer to the already complex political and military landscape. It's truly a remarkable feat, isn't it, to essentially invent an alphabet for the purpose of religious conversion. The constant state of warfare along the Danube frontier also led to significant demographic shifts. Roman citizens living in vulnerable areas often fled, seeking refuge deeper within imperial territory, while some Goths were eventually settled within the empire, sometimes as individuals, sometimes as entire communities. These settlements were ostensibly meant to provide agricultural labor and military recruits, but they also created potential internal security risks. The Roman authorities were essentially playing a high-stakes game of demographic chess, trying to balance military necessity with the inherent dangers of integrating large numbers of a previously hostile people. It was a strategy born of desperation as much as design, and its long-term consequences would prove to be profound. The simmering tensions along the Danube frontier finally erupted into a conflagration that would forever be etched in Roman memory. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. This wasn't merely another border skirmish. It was a cataclysmic event that shook the foundations of the Eastern Roman Empire and signaled a profound shift in the balance of power between Rome and its so-called barbarian neighbors. The stage for this disaster had been set by a series of events, beginning with the terrifying appearance of the Huns from the east, a nomadic people whose ferocity and military prowess struck fear into the hearts of all who encountered them. Their westward advance had a cascading effect, pushing various Germanic tribes, including a large contingent of Visigoths, right up against the Roman frontier. These Visigoths, led by chieftains Fritigern and Alavivus, found themselves in an untenable position, trapped between the advancing Huns and the formidable Danube River, beyond which lay Roman territory. Desperate, they appealed to the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross the Danube and settle within the empire's borders. Valens, perhaps seeing an opportunity to gain new recruits for his legions and to stabilize the frontier, granted their request, but with conditions. The Goths were to surrender their weapons, their children were to be taken as hostages, and they would be supplied with provisions. What could possibly go wrong, right? It sounds like a perfectly reasonable plan on paper, if you ignore centuries of mutual distrust and the inherent logistical nightmares of feeding tens of thousands of desperate people. The reality, however, was a predictable bureaucratic nightmare mixed with outright corruption. Roman officials tasked with overseeing the Gothic settlement proved to be either incompetent or avaricious, or both. The promised provisions were either meager or entirely absent, forcing the starving Goths to trade their few remaining possessions, and even their children, for food, often at exorbitant prices. The conditions in the temporary camps were deplorable, leading to widespread suffering and resentment. It's hard to imagine a more perfect recipe for disaster than a massive group of armed, starving, and increasingly angry warriors being mistreated by their supposed hosts. The situation quickly spiraled out of control as hunger and humiliation festered, turning erstwhile supplicants into desperate rebels. The spark that ignited the rebellion is a matter of some debate, but it seems to have been a combination of Roman provocation and Gothic desperation. Roman commanders attempted to disarm and disperse some of the Gothic contingents, leading to violent confrontations. Soon, the scattered Gothic groups coalesced, driven by a shared sense of grievance and a renewed martial purpose. They began to plunder the Roman countryside, seeking the sustenance and retribution that had been denied to them. Emperor Valens, determined to crush the uprising and restore Roman authority, assembled a large army, drawing troops from various parts of the Eastern Empire. He was advised to wait for reinforcements from the Western Emperor Gratian, but Valens, perhaps eager for sole glory, decided to press the attack. Hubris, it turns out, is a timeless Achilles heel. The two armies met near the city of Adrianople, modern-day Edirne in Turkey, on August 9th, 378 AD. The Roman army, a formidable force, was confident of victory. However, the Goths, under the cunning leadership of Fritigern, employed a deceptive strategy. They drew the Roman forces into a prolonged march under the scorching summer sun, exhausting them before the main engagement. The decisive moment came when the Gothic cavalry, which had seemingly been absent, suddenly appeared and launched a devastating flank attack on the exposed Roman legions. The Roman infantry, already fatigued and caught off guard, broke and fled in disarray. It was a complete rout, a massacre on an epic scale. The battle itself was an unmitigated disaster for Rome. A significant portion of the Eastern Roman army was annihilated, and more importantly, Emperor Valens himself was killed in the fighting. His body was never recovered, a further indignity that only added to the humiliation of the defeat. The death of a reigning emperor at the hands of barbarians was an unprecedented catastrophe, echoing the earlier loss of Decius, but on a far grander and more devastating scale. The strategic implications were profound. The Eastern Empire was left severely weakened, its military prestige shattered, and its frontier defenses utterly compromised. For the Goths, Adrianople was a monumental triumph, confirming their military prowess and demonstrating that they could not only raid Roman territory, but utterly defeat a full Roman army in open battle. It was a psychological victory as much as a military one, showing that the age of Roman dominance was truly beginning to wane. One of the great historical debates surrounding Adrianople centers on the exact composition and tactics of the Gothic forces, while Roman accounts emphasize the Gothic cavalry. Was it truly a dominant factor, or was it the combined arms approach, including their disciplined infantry, that proved decisive? And how much of their success was due to superior Gothic generalship versus Roman blunders and overconfidence? These questions continue to be debated, highlighting the complexities of reconstructing ancient battles from often biased or incomplete sources. What is clear, however, is that Adrianople exposed fundamental weaknesses within the Roman military system and revealed the growing strength and sophistication of their Gothic adversaries. It was a lesson Rome learned the hard way, etched in the blood and dust of a Thracian battlefield. The ashes of Adrianople had barely cooled when the desperate reality of a shattered Eastern Roman army and a dead emperor forced Rome to confront a new, terrifying truth. The Goths, were no longer merely a problem to be contained. They were a power to be reckoned with, now firmly entrenched within imperial territory. The vacuum left by Valens's death and the decimation of his legions demanded an immediate and decisive response, leading to the ascension of Theodosius III, a general from Hispania who would become known as Theodosius the Great. His task was unenviable: to stabilize an empire reeling from an unprecedented defeat and to somehow manage the emboldened Visigoths now roaming freely in the Balkans. It was a diplomatic and military tightrope walk, and the outcome was far from certain. Theodosius, recognizing that outright military victory against such a formidable and numerous foe was likely impossible in the short term, opted for a policy of accommodation rather than annihilation. In 382 AD, he negotiated a treaty with the Visigoths, allowing them to settle within the Roman Empire, specifically in Moesia and Thrace, as foederati, allies who retained their own laws, customs, and internal leadership in exchange for providing military service to Rome. This was a monumental concession, unprecedented in its scope. Previously, barbarian groups had been settled, yes, but often as subjugated peoples or as scattered military units. The 382 treaty, however, recognized the Visigoths as a distinct political entity within the empire, a state within a state, retaining their cohesion and their own aristocratic structures. It was a pragmatic solution, born of necessity, but one that contained the seeds of future conflict, essentially creating a powerful, independent-minded force on Roman soil. Imagine inviting a very large, very well-armed family to live in your guest house, and then being surprised when they decide to redecorate to their own taste. This policy, while initially bringing a semblance of peace, was not without its critics. Many Romans viewed it as a shameful capitulation, a betrayal of imperial dignity, and a dangerous precedent. The idea of barbarians living autonomously within the empire, not as conquered subjects, but as allies, was deeply unsettling to the traditional Roman worldview, yet Theodosius largely stuck to his plan, integrating Gothic contingents into the Roman army, even relying on them for major campaigns, such as his own civil wars against usurpers in the West. It was during these campaigns that a young and ambitious Visigothic leader named Alaric first came to prominence. Alaric, whose name still echoes through history with a certain dark grandeur, would become the central figure in the next tumultuous chapter of Visigothic history. Born around 370 AD, likely in the Balkans, he grew up in a world where the lines between Roman and Goth were increasingly blurred, where the foederati system offered both opportunities and frustrations for Gothic leaders. He was a product of the 382 treaty, a Visigoth who served in the Roman army, fighting alongside and against Romans, gaining invaluable experience in Roman military organization and strategy. Yet, he also keenly felt the indignities and limitations imposed upon his people. He desired not just to serve Rome, but to lead his people to a secure and respected place within or alongside it, a place of dignity and autonomy that he felt they deserved. When Theodosius Thamos died in 395 AD, the empire was once again divided, this time between his two young and largely ineffectual sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This leadership vacuum provided Alaric with the perfect opportunity to assert his claims. He was a man of ambition and vision, and he saw the weakness of the imperial court as an invitation for his people to demand better terms. Alaric and his Visigoths, feeling that the terms of the 382 treaty were not being honored, particularly regarding payments and land for settlement, began to move. This wasn't just a raid for plunder. It was a political maneuver, a powerful negotiation tactic, as they swept through Thrace, Macedonia, and into Greece, notably sacking Athens. The famous story, perhaps apocryphal, suggests he spared the city after a ghostly apparition of Athena herself appeared to him. More likely, Alaric was a pragmatist who understood that destroying too much would simply reduce the long-term value of the territory. The Eastern Roman Empire, under the weak hand of Arcadius, struggled to contain Alaric. Their strategy often involved a mix of appeasement and deflection, effectively encouraging Alaric to move westward, often into the Western Roman Empire's sphere of influence. This cynical game of pass the problem would ultimately contribute to the downfall of the West. Alaric, frustrated by the lack of a permanent, satisfactory settlement, turned his attention to Italy, the heartland of the Western Empire. This decision marked a dramatic escalation, moving from raiding the provinces to directly threatening the imperial core. The Western Roman Emperor Honorius, a figure more interested in his pet chickens than governing, was largely under the influence of his brilliant but ultimately ill-fated general, Stilicho. Stilicho, himself of Vandal descent, was Rome's last truly great general in the West, and he repeatedly thwarted Alaric's attempts to gain a foothold in Italy, most notably at the battles of Pollentia and Verona. Stilicho was a master strategist, able to mobilize Roman forces and consistently outmaneuver Alaric, preventing a decisive Visigothic triumph. However, Stilicho's success bred envy and suspicion within the paranoid Roman court. It's a recurring theme in Roman history, isn't it? Where internal political squabbles prove more damaging than external enemies. The strategic genius of Stilicho, Rome's last truly effective general in the West, had for years held Alaric and his Visigoths at bay, preventing them from achieving their ultimate aim of a secure homeland within the empire. But even the most brilliant general cannot escape the poisonous currents of court intrigue and xenophobia. Stilicho, despite his unwavering loyalty and repeated victories against barbarian invaders, was of Vandal descent, a fact that his Roman rivals used to sow distrust and suspicion in the mind of the weak-willed Emperor Honorius. This internal rot, a recurring malady of the late Roman Empire, proved to be far more destructive than any external enemy. In 408 AD, fueled by baseless accusations of treason and a rising tide of anti-barbarian sentiment, Emperor Honorius ordered Stilicho's execution. It was an act of monumental folly, effectively decapitating the Western Roman Empire of its military leadership at its most vulnerable moment. Imagine voluntarily removing the only person capable of defending your house, just as a storm is about to hit. The immediate consequence was a wave of pogroms against the families of barbarian foederati serving in the Roman army, driving many of these disillusioned soldiers, along with their families, straight into Alaric's waiting arms. It was an unforced error of epic proportions, essentially handing Alaric a massive surge of experienced fighters who now had every reason to despise Rome. With Stilicho gone, the path to Italy lay open, and Alaric wasted no time. He had for years sought not the destruction of Rome, but a secure place for his people, a place where they could live without constant fear of betrayal or starvation. His goal was a treaty, land, and dignity, but Rome, now devoid of competent leadership and blinded by its own hubris, repeatedly refused his increasingly desperate pleas. So, in late 408 AD, Alaric led his Visigoths across the Alps and into the heart of Italy, initiating the first of 3 sieges of the city of Rome itself. The Eternal City, once the undisputed mistress of the Mediterranean, was now a shadow of its former self. Its population diminished, its defenses neglected, but still a potent symbol of imperial power. The first 2 sieges, in 408 and 409 AD, were not aimed at destruction, but at coercion. Alaric blockaded the city, cutting off its food supply, forcing the Roman Senate to negotiate. The demands were simple: gold, silver, silk tunics, and vast quantities of pepper, a valuable commodity at the time, demonstrating the Goths' practical understanding of trade. Each time, Rome paid a hefty ransom to lift the siege, but Honorius, safely ensconced in the marsh-protected city of Ravenna, stubbornly refused to grant Alaric the more significant concession he truly desired: a permanent land settlement for his people. This stubborn refusal, driven by a bizarre combination of pride and political paralysis, only infuriated Alaric further, pushing him towards increasingly drastic measures. It's like being repeatedly offered snacks when you're asking for a permanent home. Eventually, you just get fed up. Finally, in 410 AD, after the third failed attempt to secure a lasting agreement, Alaric returned to Rome for a third time. On August 24th, 410 AD, a gate, traditionally the Porta Salaria, was opened, either by treachery from within or by desperate citizens hoping for an end to the siege, and the Visigoths entered the city. What followed was a 3-day sack of Rome. This event, perhaps more than any other, sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world and beyond, reverberating through the intellectual circles of the time and forever, changing the psychological landscape of the empire. The Eternal City, inviolate for nearly 800 years since the Gaulish sack of 390 BC, had fallen to barbarians. However, the sack of Rome was not the brutal, destructive rampage often depicted in later sensationalized accounts. While there was indeed looting, destruction of property, and some violence, Alaric, an Arian Christian, gave specific orders to his troops to respect Christian churches and sanctuaries, particularly St. Peter's Basilica and St. Paul's outside the walls, which served as places of refuge for many citizens. He also reportedly ordered his men to avoid excessive bloodshed. This restraint, while perhaps motivated by pragmatism and a desire to preserve the city's symbolic value for future negotiations, contrasts sharply with the popular image of unbridled barbarian fury. It suggests a calculated act of political pressure rather than a mindless act of vengeance. Nevertheless, the psychological impact on the Roman world was immense. If Rome could fall, what hope was there for anyone? The fall of Rome prompted profound introspection among contemporaries. St. Augustine, a towering intellectual figure of the age, began writing his monumental work, City of God, in response to the sack, seeking to explain how such a catastrophe could befall a Christianized empire. He argued that Rome's fate was not tied to the worship of pagan gods or the adoption of Christianity, but rather to the inherent impermanence of all earthly cities compared to the eternal city of God. This intellectual debate highlights the deep societal shock and the desperate need to make sense of an event that defied all prior assumptions about Roman power and divine favor. The fate of Alaric himself after the sack is another point of historical interest and debate. Having achieved his goal of making a profound statement, he led his Visigoths south through Italy, reportedly intending to cross to Africa, perhaps to seize its rich grain supplies. However, he died suddenly in late 410 AD near Cosenza in southern Italy. According to Jordanes, his followers diverted the Busento River, buried Alaric and his treasures in the riverbed, and then diverted the river back to its original course, ensuring that his burial site would remain a secret forever, guarding his immense wealth from future generations. It's a grand, romantic, and utterly unverifiable tale, the kind of story perfectly suited for a bedtime history, leaving us with a satisfyingly mysterious end for a man who had brought Rome to its knees. With Alaric's sudden death in southern Italy, the Visigoths faced a critical juncture. Their charismatic leader was gone, they were deep within Roman territory, and their ultimate goal of a secure homeland remained elusive. However, the sack of Rome had fundamentally altered the political landscape, demonstrating definitively that the Western Roman Empire was vulnerable, perhaps fatally so. Alaric's brother-in-law, Ataulf, swiftly succeeded him as king, inheriting the formidable challenge of guiding his people in a post-Adrianople, post-Rome sack world. Ataulf was a different sort of leader than Alaric. While still a warrior, he seems to have possessed a more nuanced understanding of Roman power and the complexities of building a lasting state. His ambition was not merely to raid, but to establish a legitimate, recognized kingdom for his people. Ataulf's initial strategy involved moving the Visigoths northward through Italy, still seeking a suitable place for settlement. His reign is most famously associated with his marriage to Galla Placidia, the half-sister of Emperor Honorius, in Narbonne in 414 AD. This marriage was a truly extraordinary event, a symbolic union between a barbarian king and a princess of the imperial house. It was a clear attempt by Ataulf to legitimize his rule and to integrate his people more closely, perhaps even symbolically, with the Roman order. Some historians interpret it as a genuine attempt at forging a new, hybridized Romano-Gothic society, while others see it as a political maneuver, a calculated bid for imperial recognition. Either way, it was a move that baffled and outraged many in the Roman court, even as it intrigued others. It's one of those historical moments that truly makes you wonder about the personal motivations behind the grand political gestures. Ataulf himself articulated a vision that, if true, was remarkably forward-thinking for a barbarian king. According to the historian Orosius, Ataulf once declared that his original desire was to efface the Roman name and convert the Roman Empire into a Gothic empire, but that he had come to realize that the Goths, from their unbridled barbarism, were incapable of upholding the laws of an empire. Therefore, he decided that his true glory would be to restore and augment the Roman name by Gothic vigor, seeing himself not as a destroyer, but as a preserver and reinvigorator of the Roman system. This statement, if accurately reported, reveals a profound shift in Gothic thinking, from simple plunder to a desire for legitimate governance, and perhaps even a shared future. It's a pretty astonishing pivot, isn't it? From let's break everything to maybe we can fix this together. Despite Ataulf's grand vision, his reign was short and tumultuous. The Western Roman Empire, still under Honorius, continued to employ its strategy of negotiation, bribery and military pressure to keep the Visigoths moving. The general Constantius, who would later briefly become Emperor Constantius III, played a key role in this, effectively blockading the Visigoths and starving them into leaving Italy. This pressure, combined with internal Visigothic rivalries, eventually led Ataulf to lead his people out of Italy and across the Alps into Gaul, modern-day France, in 412 AD, and then into Hispania, modern-day Spain, in 415 AD, still seeking that elusive secure settlement. It was in Hispania that Ataulf met his end, assassinated in Barcelona in 415 AD, likely due to internal Visigothic power struggles. His death plunged the Visigoths into a brief period of instability, but the overall trajectory set by Alaric and refined by Ataulf continued. The search for a permanent home and official recognition from Rome. The Visigoths elected Wallia as their next king, a leader who proved even more pragmatic and willing to work with Rome, albeit from a position of strength. Under Wallia, a decisive shift occurred. In 418 AD, a new treaty was struck with Emperor Honorius. This time, the Visigoths were granted official permission to settle in Aquitaine, a fertile region in southwestern Gaul, specifically in the Garonne Valley. This marked the official establishment of the Visigothic kingdom in Aquitaine, the first truly significant and recognized barbarian kingdom within the borders of the Western Roman Empire. This wasn't just another temporary settlement. It was a formal grant of territory, a foedus treaty that recognized their autonomy and critically provided them with the land they had so desperately sought. The Visigoths were now, at least in theory, Rome's allies, responsible for defending the region against other barbarian groups and providing military assistance. It was a monumental achievement for the Goths, finally securing a piece of land they could call their own. The establishment of this kingdom, centered around cities like Toulouse, was a complex affair. While the Visigoths were granted land, the exact mechanism of land distribution and Roman Gothic coexistence is still a subject of scholarly debate. Did they simply take over existing Roman estates? Or was there a more formal division of land, perhaps based on a system of hospitality, hospitium, where soldiers were quartered in private homes? The traditional view suggests a widespread division of Roman lands, but more recent scholarship proposes a more nuanced system, perhaps initially focused on taking over Roman imperial lands and vacant properties, with a gradual encroachment on private estates. This open historiographic mystery highlights the challenges of understanding the practicalities of a world undergoing such rapid and profound change. It's truly difficult to know how two distinct legal and social systems merged, or simply rubbed against each other in the daily lives of people. The Visigothic kingdom in Aquitaine became a powerful regional entity, maintaining a delicate balance between independence and nominal allegiance to Rome. They continued to practice Arian Christianity, which set them apart from the Nicene Catholic Romans, creating a religious fault line that would persist for generations. Their kings, while nominally foederati of the emperor, increasingly acted as independent rulers, establishing their own administration and legal systems. This was the true beginning of the barbarian successor states that would ultimately replace the Western Roman Empire. The Goths had come a long way from their origins in Scandinavia, now ruling a significant chunk of what would become France, a testament to their adaptability and relentless pursuit of a home. While the Visigoths were busy establishing their kingdom in Aquitaine, another powerful Germanic group was making their own indelible mark on the waning Western Roman Empire, the Vandals. Their story, though not strictly Gothic, is inextricably linked to the Visigothic narrative, as their movements and ambitions profoundly impacted the strategic landscape that the Goths navigated. The Vandals, like many other barbarian groups, had been pushed westward by the Huns and had already inflicted significant damage on Roman Gaul before launching their most audacious move, crossing into Roman Africa, the breadbasket of the Western Empire. This crossing, led by their king Gaiseric in 429 AD, was a game-changer, fundamentally altering Rome's ability to feed itself and fund its armies. Gaiseric was a king of ruthless ambition and cunning, qualities that made him one of the most feared figures of his age. He understood that control of North Africa, with its vast grain supplies and wealthy cities, was tantamount to holding the Roman Empire by the throat. Within a decade, the Vandals had conquered most of the Roman provinces in North Africa, culminating in the capture of Carthage in 439 AD. The fall of Carthage, a city of immense historical and economic significance, was a strategic catastrophe for the Western Roman Empire, perhaps even more devastating in the long run than the sack of Rome itself. Imagine if a major global power today suddenly lost its primary source of food and fuel. That's the scale of the disaster this represented for Rome. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa, with its capital at Carthage, quickly developed into a formidable naval power. Gaiseric built a powerful fleet that dominated the Western Mediterranean, launching devastating raids on Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and even the coasts of Italy. These pirate-like operations not only further destabilized Roman trade routes, but also demonstrated Rome's increasing inability to project power across its own seas. It's a stark reminder that control of the seas was as crucial then as it is now. And Rome, for centuries, the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, was losing its grip. The Vandal threat directly impacted the Visigoths in Gaul and Hispania in several ways. Firstly, Rome, desperate to regain Africa, frequently diverted resources and military attention away from other fronts, including its struggles with the Visigoths and other barbarian groups in Gaul and Hispania. This often left the Visigoths with more autonomy and less immediate Roman pressure, allowing them to consolidate their gains and expand their territory. Secondly, the Vandal raids on the coasts of Hispania meant that the Visigoths, who were increasingly focusing their attention on the Iberian Peninsula, sometimes found themselves contending with Vandal incursions from the sea. This created a complex, multi-layered geopolitical chessboard where alliances shifted, and enemies of Rome could also be enemies of each other. There's a fascinating historiographical debate about the exact nature of the Vandal conquest of Africa. Was it an outright invasion, or did some disaffected elements of the local Roman population, perhaps the Donatist Christians, who faced persecution from the Nicene Roman authorities, welcome the Arian Vandals as liberators? While sources are limited, it's clear that the Vandal success was due not just to their military strength, but also to the internal divisions and weaknesses within Roman Africa. This brings up an important point about the fall of the Roman Empire generally. It was rarely a simple case of barbarians triumphing over unified Romans, but often a complex interplay of external pressure exacerbating existing internal fragilities. The Vandals, like the Visigoths, were Arian Christians, which put them at odds with the Nicene Catholic population of Africa and the broader Roman Empire. This religious difference often led to persecution of the Nicene clergy and laity in Vandal Africa, further cementing their image as brutal oppressors in Roman historical accounts. This religious schism was not just theological. It had profound political and social implications, contributing to the alienation of the Vandal rulers from their Roman subjects and from the Byzantine Empire in the East. It's a classic example of how religious differences can become deeply entwined with political power struggles. The most famous Vandal act, and one that gives us the very word vandalism today, was the sack of Rome in 455 AD. This occurred 45 years after Alaric's sack, and this time it was far more systematic and prolonged. Gaiseric's fleet landed at Portus, the port of Rome, and after 2 weeks of meticulous looting, carried off vast amounts of treasure, including the menorah and other sacred artifacts from the temple in Jerusalem, which Titus had brought to Rome in 70 AD. While there was less arson and wanton destruction than often portrayed, the methodical stripping of the city's wealth by the Vandals left it far more impoverished than Alaric's earlier, more restrained visitation. This second sack was another profound blow to Roman prestige and a stark reminder of the empire's powerlessness. The rise of the Vandal kingdom in North Africa fundamentally reshaped the strategic priorities of both the Western and Eastern Roman empires. It became a constant thorn in their side, a source of devastating raids, and a symbol of their diminishing control over their own former territories. The immense wealth generated from Africa allowed the Vandal kings to maintain their powerful fleet and army, making them a persistent and formidable adversary for over a century, until their eventual reconquest by the Byzantine Empire. Their impact on the Visigoths was indirect but significant, creating a distraction for Rome that allowed the Visigoths to pursue their own territorial ambitions relatively unmolested for a time, particularly as they looked westward towards Hispania. The mid-5th century found the Visigothic kingdom firmly established in Aquitaine, a powerful and increasingly independent entity within the crumbling edifice of the Western Roman Empire. Yet, their autonomy was constantly challenged by the shifting alliances and formidable new threats that characterized this tumultuous period. One such threat, a swirling tempest on the eastern horizon, was the Huns, led by their infamous chieftain, Attila. Attila, often known as the Scourge of God, commanded a vast, multi-ethnic confederation of warriors who had swept across the Pontic steppe, driving Germanic tribes before them, and now cast a terrifying shadow over Europe. Their westward advance forced disparate peoples, including the Visigoths and the Romans, into an uneasy yet necessary alliance. The Huns, unlike the more settled Germanic groups, were primarily nomadic pastoralists, their military strength lying in their highly mobile cavalry and their devastating composite bows. They were masters of psychological warfare, their reputation for brutal efficiency often preceding them and inducing panic. Attila's ultimate objective is still a matter of debate among historians. Was it simply plunder? Or did he envision a vast steppe empire stretching into the heart of Europe? Whatever his ultimate goal, his immediate target in the 450s became Gaul, and then potentially Italy itself. putting him on a collision course with both the Visigoths and the remnants of Roman power. Facing this existential threat, the Western Roman general Aetius, often called the last of the Romans, understood that he could not confront Attila alone. Aetius, who had spent time among the Huns as a hostage in his youth and understood their military capabilities, recognized the necessity of a broad coalition. He knew that the Visigoths, under their formidable king Theodoric I, not to be confused with the later Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, were the most powerful military force in Gaul, outside of his own dwindling legions. Despite a history of intermittent conflict with the Visigoths, Aetius forged a temporary but crucial alliance with them, persuading Theodoric to join forces against the common Hunnic enemy. It was a remarkable feat of diplomacy, uniting former adversaries against a greater threat, a bit like two rival sports teams suddenly realizing they need to work together to defeat an alien invasion. The stage was set for one of the largest and most pivotal battles in ancient history, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. The exact location of this battle, often placed near Chalons-en-Champagne in modern-day France, remains an intriguing historiographic mystery, with various archaeological theories and proposals still being debated. What is not debated, however, is the immense scale of the armies involved and the sheer brutality of the fighting. The Roman-Visigothic alliance included not only Roman legions and Visigothic warriors, but also various other Germanic tribes, such as the Franks, Alemanni, and Burgundians, all arrayed against Attila's vast Hunnic confederation, which included Ostrogoths and other subjugated peoples. It was, in essence, a battle for the future of Western Europe, a clash of civilizations on a grand scale. The battle itself, fought in 451 AD, was a chaotic, bloody affair that lasted for an entire day. It was a close-run thing, a grinding, attritional struggle, rather than a decisive tactical masterpiece. The sources describe immense casualties on both sides, with the fields reportedly awash in blood. During the intense fighting, King Theodoric I of the Visigoths was killed, a heavy blow to the allied forces. Accounts vary on how he died. Some say he was thrown from his horse and trampled, others that he was struck by an Ostrogothic spear. His death, however, did not break the Visigothic resolve. His son, Thorismund, immediately took command and rallied his people, demonstrating the fierce loyalty and martial prowess of the Visigothic aristocracy. It's a remarkable testament to their fighting spirit, to see their king fall and then immediately redouble their efforts. At the end of the day, neither side could claim a complete victory, but the outcome was a strategic success for the Roman-Visigothic alliance. Attila's advance into Gaul was halted, his forces were severely mauled, and he was forced to withdraw. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains is often considered one of history's most consequential battles, as it effectively prevented the Huns from establishing a lasting dominion over Western Europe. Had Attila prevailed, the trajectory of European development, particularly the emergence of distinct Germanic kingdoms, might have been entirely different. It was a moment when the future hung in the balance, a pivot point that could have led to a very different kind of Dark Age. After the battle, a subtle political game played out. Aetius, ever the shrewd strategist, reportedly persuaded Thorismund to return to Toulouse and secure his succession as king, rather than pursuing the Huns more aggressively. This move, while seemingly helping the Visigoths, also served Aetius's long-term goal of maintaining a balance of power in Gaul and preventing the Visigoths from becoming too powerful. It's a classic example of complex geopolitics, where allies on one day might be potential rivals on the next. Thorismund, recognizing the wisdom in consolidating his power, took Aetius's advice, though he wouldn't rule for long, soon being deposed by his brothers. The legacy of the Catalonian plains is complex. While it saved Gaul from Hunnic domination and cemented Aetius's reputation, it also highlighted the increasing reliance of the Western Roman Empire on its barbarian allies. The fact that Rome could no longer defend itself without the formidable military might of the Visigoths was a clear indicator of its terminal decline. The battle was a moment of unity, but it was a fleeting one, a temporary truce in the larger ongoing struggle for supremacy in the post-Roman West. The Visigoths had proved their immense military value, but they had also paid a heavy price, losing their king in the process, a sacrifice that underscored their growing prominence as a key player in the shaping of Europe. Despite the heroic stand at the Catalonian plains, which saw Visigoths and Romans fighting shoulder to shoulder against the Hunnic menace, the fragile alliance soon unraveled, and the Visigothic kingdom in Aquitaine found itself in renewed conflict with the ever-diminishing authority of the Western Roman Empire. The years following Attila's defeat saw the Visigoths, now under kings like Theodoric II and later Euric, steadily expanding their territory, pushing the boundaries of their foederati settlement deeper into Gaul and Hispania. The Western Roman emperors, increasingly mere puppets of their own generals, found themselves unable to stem this tide, their pleas for aid often falling on deaf ears, as their former allies turned into de facto independent rulers. It was a slow, agonizing death for Roman power in the West, with the Visigoths effectively carving out their own substantial piece of the pie. The mid-5th century was characterized by a chaotic power vacuum in the Western Roman Empire. Emperors came and went with alarming rapidity, often elevated and deposed by powerful barbarian generals who nominally served Rome but effectively controlled its armies. This internal instability provided the perfect opportunity for the Visigoths to consolidate and expand their kingdom. They were no longer merely waiting for Roman permission. They were taking what they believed was rightfully theirs, or simply what they could hold by force. The nominal recognition of their Aquitanian kingdom in 418 AD had been a critical first step, but the Visigoths had far grander ambitions, especially as Roman resistance became increasingly feckless. King Euric, who reigned from 466 to 484 AD, was perhaps the most ambitious and successful of the early Visigothic kings in Gaul. He systematically dismantled the remaining vestiges of Roman authority in southwestern Gaul and much of Hispania. Euric was a truly formidable figure, a military leader and a legislator who recognized that the time for nominal Roman oversight was over. He effectively ended the federati relationship, declaring the full independence of the Visigothic kingdom from Rome. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was backed by military might, as he annexed Roman territories, culminating in the complete takeover of Provence. Under Euric, the Visigothic kingdom reached its territorial zenith, stretching from the Loire River in the north, across most of Gaul, and deep into the Iberian Peninsula. It was a vast, powerful domain, far larger and more influential than the fragmented remnants of the Western Empire. Uric also famously began the codification of Visigothic law, culminating in the Codex Uricianus, Uric's Code, though this was more of a collection of existing laws and royal edicts rather than a systematic legal code in the Roman sense. This legal development, however, underscored the Visigothic desire to establish a legitimate, organized state, not merely a transient barbarian occupation. It also reflected the growing need to regulate the interactions between the Visigothic minority and the much larger Roman majority within their kingdom. This coexistence, always a delicate balance, was often fraught with tension, particularly due to the religious divide between the Arian Visigothic rulers and their Nicene Catholic Roman subjects. It's a challenging task, isn't it? Trying to create one set of rules for two very different groups of people living side by side. However, the Visigoths' relentless expansion into Gaul eventually brought them into conflict with another rising Germanic power, the Franks. The Franks, under their ambitious king Clovis I, were consolidating their power in northern Gaul and converting to Nicene Catholicism, the very same faith as the majority of the Roman population in Gaul. This religious alignment gave Clovis a powerful advantage, allowing him to portray his wars against the Arian Visigoths not just as territorial disputes, but as crusades against heretics. This dynamic would prove to be a fatal flaw for the Visigothic presence in Gaul. The decisive confrontation came in 507 AD at the Battle of Fouillé. Clovis, leading his Frankish forces, met the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric II, Uric's son, in a battle that would determine the future of Gaul. The Visigoths, despite their martial prowess, were decisively defeated. King Alaric II was killed during the battle, reportedly by Clovis himself. This battle was a catastrophic loss for the Visigoths, marking the effective end of their vast Aquitanian kingdom and their dominance in Gaul. It's one of those moments in history where a single battle fundamentally reshapes the map, leaving us to wonder about all the alternative paths that might have been taken. Following Fouillé, the Franks systematically absorbed most of the Visigothic territories in Gaul, pushing them south and west. The Visigoths were largely driven out of Gaul, except for a narrow strip of land along the Mediterranean coast, known as Septimania. This region, which included cities like Narbonne and Carcassonne, would remain a Visigothic stronghold for another 2 centuries, a testament to their enduring presence and their ability to cling to power even after devastating defeats. But the loss of their vast Gallic territories was a profound setback, forcing the center of Visigothic power to shift entirely to the Iberian Peninsula, which they had already begun to colonize and control. One of the ongoing scholarly debates regarding the Visigothic loss of Gaul at Fouillé concerns the extent of Roman popular support for Clovis. Did the Nicene Catholic population of Gaul actively aid the Frankish conquest against their Arian Visigothic overlords? While some sources suggest this, the reality was likely more nuanced. Many Roman aristocrats likely prioritized stability over religious purity, and the Frankish conquest was certainly not universally welcomed. However, the religious factor undoubtedly played a role in legitimizing Clovis's actions and potentially dampening local resistance to his expansion. It's a good reminder that history is rarely as simple as a clear-cut good versus evil narrative. The loss of Gaul was a critical turning point for the Visigoths. forcing them to reevaluate their strategic priorities and to fully embrace Hispania as their new homeland. The devastating defeat at the Battle of Veii in 507 AD effectively ended the Visigothic dream of a sprawling kingdom encompassing much of Gaul, forcing a monumental and definitive shift of their political and cultural center of gravity to the Iberian Peninsula. While the Visigoths had maintained a presence in Hispania since the time of Ataulf, and particularly under Euric, the loss of Aquitaine made Iberia their undisputed and sole homeland. This was not a voluntary move, but a strategic retreat under duress. Yet it ultimately paved the way for the development of a distinct and powerful Visigothic kingdom that would shape the destiny of Spain for the next 2 centuries. Imagine being forced to pack up your entire civilization and relocate, starting almost from scratch in a new, albeit familiar, land. The Visigothic presence in Hispania prior to 507 AD had been intermittent and often focused on campaigns against other barbarian groups, such as the Suebi in the northwest and the Vandals, who had largely departed for North Africa. With the Frankish conquest of Gaul, the remaining Visigothic nobility and their retinues, along with a significant portion of the Arian clergy, streamed across the Pyrenees, seeking refuge and a new future in the peninsula. This influx of people and power transformed Hispania from a Roman province, albeit one with a barbarian presence, into the undisputed heartland of the Visigothic state. The early years of this newly consolidated Visigothic kingdom in Iberia were marked by continued conflict and consolidation. The Visigoths had to contend not only with the remaining Roman populations and their local aristocratic structures, but also with other Germanic groups, most notably the Suebi, in what is now Galicia and northern Portugal. The Suebic kingdom, established in the early 5th century, presented a distinct challenge, and it took decades of intermittent warfare before the Visigoths finally conquered and absorbed the Suebic territories in 585 AD under King Leovigild, finally unifying the entire peninsula under Visigothic rule. This slow process of subjugation and integration speaks to the complexity of establishing dominance over a diverse array of peoples. The city of Toledo emerged as the undisputed capital of the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia, replacing the earlier center of Toulouse. Its central location, strategic defensibility, and pre-existing Roman infrastructure made it an ideal choice for the new seat of power. Toledo became not just the political capital, but also the religious and cultural heart of the kingdom, a hub where Visigothic kings established their court, minted coins, and issued laws. This transition from a peripatetic people to one with a fixed, grand capital reflects the Visigoths' growing ambition to establish a stable and lasting state, a true successor to Roman authority in the West. One of the great challenges for the Visigothic kings in Iberia was integrating the Visigothic ruling minority with the much larger Hispano-Roman majority. This wasn't merely a political or military challenge. It was deeply cultural and, crucially, religious. The Visigothic elite remained staunchly Arian Christian, while the vast majority of the Hispano-Roman population adhered to Nicene Catholicism. This theological divide created a persistent source of tension, suspicion, and sometimes outright persecution. The Arian kings, fearing the influence of the powerful Catholic bishops and their ties to the Byzantine Empire, often restricted Catholic practices and even exiled prominent Catholic figures. This religious schism was a significant barrier to complete social cohesion, preventing the seamless fusion of the two peoples. It's hard to imagine two groups of people living together, yet unable to fully trust each other because of such a fundamental difference in belief. However, despite these religious tensions, the Visigoths also showed a remarkable degree of cultural assimilation. They adopted Latin as their administrative and legal language, eventually abandoning their own Gothic language, though traces would persist for centuries. They also maintained and adapted Roman legal traditions, demonstrating a pragmatic recognition of the sophistication of Roman governance. The Visigothic kings, far from being mere barbarian warlords, increasingly saw themselves as inheritors of the Roman mantle, issuing laws and administrating justice in a manner that consciously echoed Roman imperial practices. This desire for legitimacy and continuity speaks volumes about the enduring prestige of the Roman Empire, even in its decline. The Visigothic kingdom in Iberia also distinguished itself by its unique legal system. While the Codex Euricianus had been an early attempt, later kings, particularly Leovigild and Regiswinth, developed a more comprehensive and sophisticated body of law known as the Lex Visigothorum, also known as the Forum Judicum or the Visigothic Code. This code was groundbreaking because, unlike earlier barbarian law codes that applied only to the barbarian population, the Lex Visigothorum applied to all subjects of the kingdom, both Goths and Romans, eliminating the legal distinction between the two groups. This was a significant step towards legal unity and was centuries ahead of its time compared to other Germanic kingdoms. This legal innovation represents a major historiographic puzzle. How did a society with such deep religious divisions manage to create such a unified legal framework? It's a testament to the intellectual and administrative capabilities of the Visigothic monarchy. The religious landscape of the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia, characterized by the stark divide between the ruling Arian Visigoths and their Nicene Catholic Hispano-Roman subjects, was a persistent source of internal tension and political instability. This theological schism, which had its roots in the early conversion of the Goths by Ulfilas, was more than just a matter of differing doctrines. It was a fundamental barrier to the complete integration of the two peoples. Imagine living under rulers who believe your path to salvation is inherently flawed, and whose religious practices feel alien or even heretical to you. That was the daily reality for many Hispano-Romans, and it naturally bred resentment and suspicion. While Arianism was the official faith of the Visigothic monarchy and aristocracy, Nicene Catholicism held sway over the vast majority of the Romanized population. The Catholic bishops, deeply embedded in urban centers and commanding significant loyalty, represented a powerful parallel authority, often looking to the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople as their spiritual and sometimes political protector. This dynamic made the Catholic Church a potential rallying point for opposition to Arian rule, and Visigothic kings were acutely aware of this threat. They often responded with policies of varying severity, ranging from mild discrimination to outright persecution of Catholic clergy and confiscation of church property. The most dramatic and significant shift in this religious landscape occurred under King Recared of Monge, who ascended to the throne in 586 AD. Recared the son of the powerful King Leovigild, who had himself tried to enforce Arianism more vigorously, made the monumental decision to convert from Arianism to Nicene Catholicism. This was not merely a personal conversion, it was a state-sponsored conversion, announced at the Third Council of Toledo in 589 AD. Imagine the sheer audacity, the political courage it must have taken for a king to abandon the ancestral faith of his people and embrace the religion of his subjects, particularly when that faith had been a cornerstone of his family's rule for generations. It's the kind of move that either secures your legacy or gets you deposed, or both, if you're particularly unlucky. Recared's conversion was a masterstroke of political pragmatism. He recognized that the religious divide was severely weakening his kingdom, fostering internal dissent and providing a pretext for foreign intervention, particularly from the Byzantines, who still held some coastal enclaves in Hispania. By converting, he aimed to unite his kingdom under a single faith, to win the loyalty of the powerful Catholic bishops and the Hispano-Roman population, and to remove a major source of external pressure. The council was a carefully orchestrated event, where leading Arian bishops also publicly renounced their faith, signifying a sweeping, albeit perhaps not entirely genuine, conversion of the Visigothic elite. The consequences of this conversion were profound and far-reaching. The immediate impact was a significant reduction in internal religious strife. The Catholic Church, now allied with the monarchy, became a powerful pillar of the Visigothic state. The councils of Toledo, which had previously been purely ecclesiastical gatherings, transformed into joint church-state assemblies, where kings presided, and bishops played a crucial role in shaping legislation and advising the monarch. This close relationship between church and state became a defining characteristic of the Visigothic kingdom and would leave a lasting legacy on the political and religious development of the Iberian Peninsula. It's almost as if the church suddenly became the ultimate civil service, providing legitimacy and administrative backbone to the kings. However, the transition was not entirely smooth. Some Visigothic nobles and Arian clergy resisted the conversion, leading to a few isolated rebellions. But Recard, with the backing of the majority of the aristocracy and the full support of the Catholic Church, successfully suppressed them. This demonstrates the king's firm grip on power and the strategic foresight behind his decision. The shift also meant a gradual assimilation of the Visigothic identity into the broader Hispano-Roman culture. Over time, the distinct Gothic language faded, and intermarriage became more common, blurring the lines between the two formerly separate peoples. The period following Recared's conversion saw a flourishing of Visigothic culture, often referred to as a Visigothic Renaissance. Scholars like Isidore of Seville, one of the most influential intellectuals of the early Middle Ages, flourished under this unified religious environment. His Etymologiae, an enormous encyclopedia of knowledge from the ancient world, became a standard textbook for centuries and provides invaluable insight into the intellectual life of the period. This cultural flowering, supported by a more unified society, highlights the benefits of overcoming the divisive Arian-Nicene split. One of the scholarly debates surrounding Recared's conversion is its sincerity. Was it a genuine spiritual awakening or a cynical political calculation? While it's impossible to truly know the contents of a 6th century king's heart, the immediate and long-term benefits to the stability and power of the Visigothic state strongly suggest a pragmatic political motive. Nevertheless, regardless of his personal conviction, the impact of his decision was undeniably transformative, fundamentally reshaping the religious, social, and political fabric of the kingdom. It's one of those instances where the end result matters far more than the initial motivation. The shift from Arianism to Catholicism cemented the Visigothic kingdom's position as a legitimate successor state to Rome and laid crucial groundwork for the future of Christian Spain. With the momentous conversion to Nicene Catholicism under King Recared, the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia entered a new era, one characterized by increasing legal sophistication and a determined effort to forge a cohesive society out of its disparate Gothic and Hispano-Roman elements. The religious unity, while not immediately eradicating all social distinctions, certainly paved the way for a more integrated approach to governance, particularly in the realm of law. The Visigothic kings understood that a stable state required clear universal laws that applied to all their subjects, irrespective of their ethnic origin. This ambition culminated in the creation of one of the most remarkable legal codes of the early Middle Ages, the Lex Visigothorum, often referred to as the Visigothic Code, or the Forum Judicum. The development of this comprehensive legal system was not a sudden event, but an evolutionary process. Earlier Visigothic law codes, such as the Codex Euricianus, dating back to King Euric in the late 5th century, had primarily applied to the Goths themselves, maintaining a system of personal law where Romans were still subject to Roman law. This dual legal system, common in many early Germanic kingdoms, reflected the initial separation between conquerors and conquered. However, as the Visigoths settled and intermingled, and especially after the religious unification, the practical need for a single, overarching legal framework became increasingly apparent. Imagine trying to run a country where different groups of people live by entirely different rule books. It's a recipe for chaos, isn't it? King Leovigild reigned 568–586 AD. Recared's father played a crucial role in this legal evolution even before the conversion. He initiated reforms that updated and expanded the Codex Euricianus, making some of its provisions applicable to Romans as well. His efforts laid the groundwork for a more unified system, demonstrating a clear royal intent to reduce legal disparities. This was a bold move for an Arian king, showing a pragmatic approach to governance that transcended purely religious divides. However, the definitive achievement in Visigothic law came under King Regiswinth, reigned 649–672 AD, who promulgated the Lex Visigothorum in 654 AD. This code was revolutionary for its time because it explicitly abolished the principle of personal law and established territorial law, meaning its provisions applied equally to all inhabitants of the kingdom, whether Goth or Roman. This was a radical departure from the norm in post-Roman Europe, and a powerful statement about the Visigothic monarchy's vision of a unified society. The Lex Visigothorum was not just a collection of existing laws. It was a carefully structured and comprehensive legal document covering everything from criminal offenses and property rights to marriage and inheritance. It drew upon both Roman legal traditions, particularly the Theodosian Code and later Roman legal commentaries, and Germanic customary law, creating a sophisticated synthesis that reflected the unique blend of cultures in Visigothic Spain. The content of the Lex Visigothorum offers fascinating insights into Visigothic society. It reveals a surprisingly detailed concern for justice and public order. For instance, it included strict penalties against corruption, bribery, and false testimony, reflecting a desire to maintain the integrity of the legal system. It also contained provisions for the protection of women and children, often more progressive than contemporary legal codes in other parts of Europe. One particular point of scholarly debate is the extent to which the code genuinely reflected daily practice versus ideal aspirations. Did people actually live by these laws in the remote countryside, or were they primarily an expression of royal authority and a blueprint for a desired social order? This open question highlights the challenge of using legal texts as direct reflections of social reality. Beyond law, the Visigothic kingdom developed a unique social structure that blended Roman aristocratic traditions with Germanic warrior culture. The Visigothic kings ruled with the support of a powerful nobility, comprising both Gothic and increasingly Roman families who had intermarried or assimilated. This aristocracy controlled vast estates and wielded significant local power, often acting as military commanders and judicial officials. Beneath them were various strata of free peasants, both Gothic and Roman, who worked the land, and a significant population of slaves. Slavery, inherited from the Roman system, continued to be a fundamental part of the economy, though the laws within the Lex Visigothorum often sought to regulate it, even offering paths to manumission. The role of the church in Visigothic society became paramount after the conversion. The councils of Toledo, now joint royal ecclesiastical assemblies, were not just religious gatherings, but effective legislative bodies. Bishops advised the kings, participated in the selection of monarchs, especially after the elective nature of the Visigothic monarchy became more pronounced, and played a crucial role in the administration of justice. This close intertwining of church and state gave the Visigothic kingdom a distinctly theocratic flavor, unlike many other early medieval states. The education of the elite, too, largely fell under the purview of the church, with monasteries and episcopal schools serving as centers of learning. It's hard to overstate the influence of the clergy in shaping the intellectual and moral framework of the kingdom. The economy of Visigothic Spain remained primarily agrarian, based on the cultivation of grains, olives, and grapes. Trade, while diminished from Roman imperial levels, still continued, particularly in luxury goods and between the major urban centers. Cities like Toledo, Seville, and Merida maintained some of their Roman infrastructure and continued to function as administrative and economic hubs, though their overall size and prosperity had declined significantly from their Roman heyday. The Visigothic kings also sought to promote coinage, issuing their own distinctive gold tremisses, further asserting their sovereignty and economic independence. The Visigothic kingdom thus presented a fascinating fusion of cultures: a Germanic ruling elite, gradually adopting Latin language and Roman legal and administrative structures, while maintaining certain aspects of their own customs, all bound together by a shared Nicene Catholic faith. This unique synthesis created a stable, albeit sometimes fractious, state that provided a foundation for the later development of medieval Spain. It was a society struggling to find its own identity in the wake of imperial collapse, a complex blend of old and new, barbarian and Roman, that would endure for over 2 centuries, while the Visigoths were forging their unique kingdom in Iberia. Another branch of the Gothic family tree, the Ostrogoths, was embarking on a parallel, yet ultimately distinct and tragic, journey in the eastern half of the Roman world. Their story is deeply intertwined with the shifting political landscape of the late 5th century, marked by the decline of the Western Roman Empire and the enduring, albeit sometimes tenuous, power of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople. The Ostrogoths, whose name literally means Eastern Goths, had initially remained in the Pannonian Plains and regions north of the Black Sea after the Gothic migrations, often living under Hunnic domination or as loose federations of tribes. The collapse of Attila's Hunnic Empire after his death in 453 AD created a power vacuum in Eastern Europe, which the Ostrogoths, under a succession of powerful leaders, were quick to exploit. They established themselves as a significant military force in the Balkans, often acting as foederati for the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes as unruly allies, sometimes as outright enemies. Their relationship with Constantinople was a delicate dance of diplomacy, subsidies, and threats. The Eastern emperors, wary of their military prowess, often sought to appease them with payments and titles, while simultaneously trying to deflect them away from Constantinople and its rich surrounding provinces. It's a classic case of trying to manage a powerful, unpredictable neighbor, isn't it? The central figure in the Ostrogothic ascendancy was Theodoric, later known as Theodoric the Great. Born around 454 AD, Theodoric was a member of the Amal dynasty, a noble Ostrogothic family. As a young man, he spent a decade, from roughly 461–471 AD, as a hostage in Constantinople, a common practice at the time meant to ensure loyalty. This period proved to be incredibly formative for him. He received a Roman education, learned Latin and Greek, and gained an intimate understanding of Roman imperial politics, administration, and military tactics. This unique blend of Gothic martial tradition and Roman intellectual and political sophistication would define his later reign. Imagine being sent off to live in the rival superpower's capital for 10 years. You'd either become a defector or come back with a whole new skill set, wouldn't you? Upon his return to his people, Theodoric quickly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming king of the Ostrogoths. His early career was marked by a complex relationship with the Eastern Roman Empire. He alternated between being a valuable ally, fighting on behalf of the emperor, and a dangerous rival, threatening Constantinople itself. The Eastern Emperor Zeno, finding Theodoric and his large Ostrogothic host a constant source of trouble in the Balkans, devised a cunning, if risky, solution. He encouraged Theodoric to invade Italy and overthrow the barbarian Odoacer, who had deposed the last Western Roman emperor in 476 AD and was ruling Italy as an independent king. This was a brilliant strategic move by Zeno. It simultaneously removed a dangerous Gothic presence from the Balkans, reasserted nominal imperial control over Italy through a Gothic proxy, and eliminated Odoacer, who was seen as an illegitimate ruler. Theodoric, for his part, saw an opportunity to establish a glorious kingdom for his people in the heartland of the former Western Roman Empire. He led his entire people, estimated to be between 100,000 and 200,000 strong, on a monumental migration across the Alps into Italy in 408 AD. This was not a quick raid, but a mass movement of an entire society, warriors, women, children, and all their possessions. The conquest of Italy was a long and arduous process, taking several years. Odoacer, a capable ruler in his own right, put up a fierce resistance. The decisive phase involved a prolonged siege of Ravenna, Odoacer's capital, which lasted for 2 years. Finally, in 493 AD, Theodoric and Odoacer negotiated a peace treaty, agreeing to rule Italy jointly. However, this arrangement proved short-lived. Theodoric, during a banquet ostensibly celebrating the new peace, personally murdered Odoacer, consolidating his sole rule over Italy. It was a brutal, pragmatic act, typical of the cutthroat politics of the age, and a stark reminder that even diplomatic solutions could end in bloodshed. Thus, in 493 AD, Theodoric the Great established the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, a realm that he would rule for over 30 years. He envisioned himself not as a mere barbarian king, but as a legitimate successor to the Roman emperors, ruling in their stead and preserving Roman culture and institutions. He received the patricius title from the Eastern Emperor, granting him a degree of imperial legitimacy, and he largely governed Italy through the existing Roman administrative apparatus, appointing Romans to high civil offices and maintaining the Roman Senate. This was a deliberate policy of continuity, aimed at reassuring the Roman population and integrating them into his new regime. It was a far more subtle approach than simply plundering and destroying, reflecting Theodoric's unique Roman education. The establishment of the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy represents a significant historiographic debate. To what extent was it a genuinely Roman barbarian synthesis, or merely a temporary accommodation that masked underlying tensions? Theodoric's attempts to rule justly and to preserve Roman institutions are well documented. Yet the fact remained that the Goths were Arian Christians and the Romans Nicene Catholics. This religious difference, while tolerated by Theodoric, always represented a fault line in his kingdom and would ultimately contribute to its undoing. The reign of Theodoric the Great in Italy, 493–526 AD, represents a truly remarkable, if ultimately fleeting, attempt to forge a viable Romano-Gothic state, one that aimed to preserve the best of Roman civilization while integrating the martial vigor of the Ostrogoths. Having established his kingdom through conquest and cunning, Theodoric embarked on a sophisticated policy of coexistence, seeking to rule justly over both his Gothic warriors and the much larger Romanized population of Italy. He explicitly articulated a vision of two peoples, one law, or rather, two distinct legal systems living side by side, but under one ruler, aiming for a peaceful, if not entirely integrated, society. It's an ambitious goal, isn't it? Trying to make two vastly different groups feel equally at home in the same house, especially when one arrived by force. The administrative structure of Theodoric's kingdom was a fascinating blend of Roman and Gothic elements. He largely maintained the existing Roman civil administration, staffing the bureaucracy with educated Roman aristocrats. Figures like Cassiodorus and Boethius, two of the most brilliant Roman intellectuals of the era, served as high-ranking officials in Theodoric's court, attesting to his respect for Roman learning and administrative expertise. The Roman Senate, though stripped of its imperial power, continued to function, lending an air of legitimacy and continuity to Theodoric's rule. This reliance on Roman expertise was a pragmatic choice. The Goths, despite their military prowess, lacked the institutional knowledge to run a complex centralized state. The Gothic population, on the other hand, formed the military backbone of the kingdom. They lived under their own customary law, distinct from the Roman law that applied to their Roman neighbors, though both were ultimately subject to the king's overarching authority. The Goths were primarily concentrated in specific garrisons and rural settlements, acting as the kingdom's defenders and police force. They provided the military muscle, while the Romans provided the administrative and economic infrastructure. This separate but coexisting policy was designed to prevent friction, allowing each group to largely maintain its own customs and traditions, while both benefited from the stability provided by Theodoric's strong rule. Theodoric's capital was Ravenna, a strategically defensible city on the Adriatic coast that had served as the Western Roman Empire's capital for much of its final century. Under Theodoric, Ravenna flourished, becoming a center of art and architecture, a testament to his patronage. Magnificent Arian churches, such as the Basilica of Santa Pollinare Nuovo and the Arian Baptistery, were constructed, showcasing the distinct architectural style of the period and the prevailing Arian faith of the Ostrogothic ruling class. These structures, adorned with stunning mosaics, stand today as enduring monuments to Theodoric's reign and the unique cultural synthesis he attempted to foster. Economically, Theodoric's rule brought a period of stability and prosperity to Italy after decades of chaos. He maintained the Roman taxation system, but also sought to improve agricultural output and restore public infrastructure, including aqueducts and public buildings. Trade, though not at its imperial peak, was encouraged, and Theodoric's gold coinage demonstrated the kingdom's economic self-sufficiency. This period of relative peace and good governance contrasted sharply with the endemic warfare and instability that plagued other parts of the former Western Empire, demonstrating the potential for barbarian rulers to offer effective leadership. However, the inherent fragility of Theodoric's system lay in the fundamental religious divide. Theodoric, despite his tolerance, remained a devout Arian, while the vast majority of his Roman subjects, and crucially, the powerful Byzantine Empire in the East, were Nicene Catholic. This religious difference became an increasingly significant point of tension as Theodoric aged and as the Eastern Empire, under a resurgent emperor, began to eye Italy with renewed imperial ambition. The Catholic Church in Italy, though generally respectful of Theodoric, maintained strong ties with Constantinople, a source of constant anxiety for the Ostrogothic king. Towards the end of his reign, Theodoric's policy of tolerance began to fray, possibly due to paranoia and the increasingly hostile religious climate emanating from Constantinople. He began to suspect plots and perceived disloyalty among his Roman advisors. The tragic downfall of Boethius and Symmachus, two of his most trusted Roman officials, epitomizes this shift. Boethius, a philosopher and statesman, was accused of treason and executed in 524 AD. While imprisoned, he wrote his enduring philosophical masterpiece, The Consolation of Philosophy. This persecution of prominent Roman figures cast a dark shadow over Theodoric's legacy and suggested that the dream of a harmonious Romano-Gothic state was perhaps unattainable in the long run. It's a stark reminder that even the most enlightened rulers can succumb to the pressures of suspicion and fear. The death of Theodoric the Great in 526 AD marked the end of an era. He had managed to maintain an independent Gothic kingdom in Italy for over 3 decades, a remarkable feat given the turbulent times. However, his successors lacked his vision, his political acumen, and his diplomatic skill. The internal divisions within the Ostrogothic ruling class, combined with the festering religious tension with the Roman population and the ambitious designs of the Byzantine Empire, left his carefully constructed kingdom vulnerable. The stage was set for a new and even more devastating conflict that would ultimately consume the Ostrogothic dream of Italy. The death of Theodoric the Great in 526 AD plunged the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy into a period of acute instability, effectively ending the fragile peace and prosperity he had painstakingly cultivated. His carefully constructed system of Roman Gothic coexistence proved to be utterly dependent on his singular personality and diplomatic skill. His young grandson, Athalaric, succeeded him, but the true power lay with Athalaric's mother, Amalasuntha, Theodoric's daughter. Amalasuntha was a Roman-educated woman who genuinely sought to continue her father's policies of collaboration with the Roman elite and rapprochement with the Eastern Roman Empire. However, her attempts to maintain stability were met with fierce resistance from a faction of the Ostrogothic nobility, who resented her Roman sympathies and her effeminate intellectual son. They yearned for a return to what they perceived as traditional Gothic martial values, rejecting the perceived softness of Roman ways. It was a classic clash between those who embraced integration and those who clung fiercely to a distinct identity. And unfortunately for the Goths, the latter often held the sharper swords. This internal strife within the Ostrogothic ruling class provided the perfect pretext for the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire to intervene. The Byzantine Emperor, Justinian I, reigned 527–565 AD, was a man of boundless ambition and relentless energy, obsessed with the idea of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory. He envisioned a reconquest of the lost western provinces, and Italy, the heartland of the old empire, was his primary target. The internal turmoil within the Ostrogothic kingdom, particularly the murder of Amalasuntha in 535 AD by her cousin Theodahad, whom she had made co-ruler in a desperate bid to shore up her power, provided Justinian with the moral and political justification he needed to launch his grand reconquest. He framed his intervention as an act of liberation for the Catholic population of Italy and avenging the murder of a pro-Roman queen. Justinian entrusted the command of his expeditionary forces to his most brilliant general, Belisarius. Belisarius was a military genius, fresh from his successful reconquest of North Africa from the Vandals, a campaign that had been surprisingly swift and decisive. He invaded Italy in 535 AD, landing in Sicily and rapidly advancing north. The initial phases of the war, known as the Gothic War, saw swift Byzantine successes. Belisarius captured Naples, and then, in 536 AD, he marched into Rome, which surrendered without a fight. The Ostrogoths, under a series of ineffective leaders, struggled to mount a coherent defense, their internal divisions weakening their military response. It must have been a truly jarring experience for the Romans of Italy, seeing one Gothic overlord replaced by another, backed by an army claiming to be their liberators. However, the war quickly devolved into a brutal, protracted conflict that would last for nearly 2 decades, devastating Italy and utterly destroying any lingering hopes of a stable Gothic kingdom. The Ostrogoths, realizing their very existence was at stake, rallied under new, more competent kings like Witigis and later the charismatic Totila. They adopted guerrilla tactics, launched counteroffensives, and proved to be far more resilient than Justinian had anticipated. The war became a grinding attritional struggle, marked by sieges, betrayals, and immense suffering for the civilian population. Rome itself changed hands multiple times, besieged and rebesieged, its ancient monuments scarred by the fighting, its population decimated by war, famine, and plague. Imagine a city that had stood for a millennium, becoming a constant battleground, a sad shell of its former glory. One of the great historical mysteries of the Gothic War is the leadership of Belisarius. Despite his undeniable military brilliance, he was often hampered by insufficient resources, political intrigue from Constantinople, and the emperor's suspicion of his growing prestige. At crucial moments, his campaigns were undermined by the arrival of other Byzantine generals or by the recall of his forces, allowing the Ostrogoths to regain lost ground. This constant second-guessing and lack of full commitment from Constantinople prolonged the war and contributed to its horrific cost. It's almost as if Justinian wanted to win, but not too easily, lest his generals become too powerful. The latter stages of the war, especially after the recall of Belisarius, saw the Ostrogoths, under King Totila, reigned 540 and 552 AD, achieve remarkable successes, even briefly recapturing Rome. Totila was a skilled military leader who managed to revive Gothic morale and inflicted several defeats on the Byzantines. He appealed to the Roman population, promising land and tax reform, trying to win their loyalty against the perceived Byzantine oppressors. This period of renewed Gothic strength shows that their military spirit had not been entirely broken, even after years of relentless warfare. Ultimately, however, the sheer scale of Byzantine resources and Justinian's unwavering determination proved decisive. In 552 AD, the aged but formidable Byzantine general Narses replaced Belisarius. Narses, with a larger and better equipped army, managed to corner Totila at the Battle of Tagine, where the Ostrogothic king was killed. This battle effectively broke the back of Ostrogothic resistance. A final Gothic stand under their last king, Dea, was crushed at the Battle of Mons Lactarius in 553 AD, where Dea also perished. The Gothic War finally ended, leaving Italy utterly devastated, its urban centers in ruins, its economy shattered, and its population drastically reduced. The long and brutal Gothic War, waged by the Byzantine Empire under Justinian I, effectively brought about the final demise of the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy. After nearly 2 decades of unrelenting conflict, marked by immense destruction and loss of life, the last vestiges of Ostrogothic power were extinguished with the deaths of Totila and Dea in 552 and 553 AD, respectively. The peninsula, once the jewel in Theodoric the Great's crown, was left utterly devastated, its urban centers depopulated, its agricultural lands lying fallow, and its sophisticated infrastructure, built over centuries of Roman rule and maintained by the Ostrogoths, largely in ruins. It was a Pyrrhic victory for Justinian, who had indeed reconquered Italy, but had inherited a shattered land. Imagine fighting tooth and nail for something, only to realize that by the time you've won, It's barely recognizable, a shadow of its former self. With the Ostrogoths decisively defeated, Italy was formally reincorporated into the Byzantine Empire. Justinian, triumphant, issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 554 AD, a decree that aimed to restore order, property rights, and Roman administrative structures to the ravaged peninsula. He appointed a new exarch, based in Ravenna, to govern the province, and sought to revive the Roman Senate in Rome, though its actual power was minimal. The intention was to reintegrate Italy seamlessly into the imperial fold, returning it to its former glory under Constantinople's direct rule. However, the reality on the ground was far more complex and dire. The Byzantine reconquest, while militarily successful, had been incredibly costly, both in terms of manpower and financial resources. The prolonged warfare had drained the imperial treasury, and the troops stationed in Italy were often insufficient to truly secure the vast territory or to resist new incursions. The Byzantine administration, accustomed to the more centralized and prosperous East, struggled to manage the chaotic and impoverished conditions in Italy. The promises of restoration often remained unfulfilled, leading to widespread disillusionment among the surviving Roman population. They had traded one set of masters for another, and the new ones seemed to offer little in the way of immediate relief from the grinding poverty and insecurity. The Gothic population of Italy, those who survived the war, faced an uncertain future. Many were killed in battle, others fled, and some were integrated into the Byzantine system as soldiers or laborers, though their distinct identity largely dissolved. Their Arian faith, already suppressed, now faced even greater pressure from the triumphant Nicene Catholicism. Backed by the full might of the Byzantine state, the dream of a lasting Ostrogothic kingdom, a synthesis of Roman and Germanic traditions, vanished with the final defeat, leaving behind only the ruins of their grand architecture in Ravenna as a silent testament to their brief, brilliant reign. However, the peace that the Byzantines brought to Italy was short-lived, almost tragically so. Just 15 years after the official end of the Gothic War, in 568 AD, a new Germanic people, the Lombards, invaded Italy. They swept down from Pannonia, exploiting the weakness of the exhausted Byzantine forces and the devastated state of the country. The Lombards, unlike the Ostrogoths, were not interested in preserving Roman institutions or integrating into existing society in the same sophisticated manner. They were more akin to traditional conquerors, establishing their own kingdom in northern and central Italy, and effectively splintering the peninsula into Byzantine and Lombard zones of control. This new invasion undid much of Justinian's costly reconquest, leaving Italy fragmented for centuries. It's almost as if the universe decided Italy hadn't suffered enough and sent in a fresh wave of invaders just to make sure. The scholarly debate surrounding Justinian's Gothic War is multifaceted. Was it truly a restoration of the Roman Empire, or did it ultimately accelerate the decline of the West by exhausting Byzantine resources and leaving Italy vulnerable to further incursions? Many historians argue that the war was a strategic blunder, diverting vast resources that could have been better used to defend the more vital eastern frontiers against the Sasanian Persians or the burgeoning Arab threat. Furthermore, the sheer destructiveness of the war pushed Italy into an economic and demographic decline from which it would not fully recover for centuries. effectively ushering in the Dark Ages for the peninsula. The fate of the Goths, in the wake of the Ostrogothic collapse, contrasts sharply with their Visigothic cousins in Hispania. While the Ostrogothic identity largely disappeared, absorbed or annihilated, the Visigoths managed to adapt, consolidate, and ultimately establish a long-lasting kingdom. This divergence highlights the importance of leadership, strategic choices, and the unique geopolitical circumstances that each Gothic group faced. Theodoric's vision for Italy, though brilliant, was perhaps too ambitious for the realities of the 6th century, and his successors lacked the strength to defend it against a determined imperial power. The destruction of the Ostrogothic kingdom served as a grim lesson for other barbarian successor states. The Eastern Roman Empire, though formidable, could not be directly challenged for long without catastrophic consequences, while the Ostrogothic dream of a unified Italy lay shattered amidst the ruins of Justinian's wars. Their Visigothic cousins in the Iberian Peninsula continued to forge a distinct and surprisingly resilient kingdom. However, even the Visigothic state, which had successfully integrated its diverse populations under a unified Catholic faith and sophisticated legal code, was not immune to the internal fissures and external pressures that characterized the early medieval period. The 7th century, in particular, saw the Visigothic kingdom grapple with a complex interplay of strong monarchical ambitions, powerful aristocratic factions, and the persistent, if sometimes overstated, issue of religious minorities. It was a time of consolidation, but also one of underlying instability, a slow-burning fuse leading to an explosive conclusion. The Visigothic monarchy, while successful in unifying the peninsula, struggled with a fundamental weakness: its elective nature. Unlike the hereditary succession that became the norm in many other European monarchies, Visigothic kings were elected by the nobility and bishops. While this theoretically allowed for the selection of the most competent ruler, in practice it led to frequent coups, assassinations, and civil wars as rival factions vied for the throne. Each succession was a moment of profound vulnerability, inviting intrigue and sometimes open conflict. Imagine trying to run a country when every time the leader dies, there's a free-for-all among the most powerful families, rather than a clear line of succession. It's a recipe for instability, isn't it? Despite this inherent instability, some Visigothic kings were remarkably strong and effective. Figures like Sigismund, reigned 612–621 AD, and Chindeswinth, reigned 642–653 AD, sought to strengthen royal authority and impose order. Sigismund, for instance, expanded Visigothic control over the last Byzantine enclaves in Hispania, effectively ending the Byzantine presence in the peninsula and truly unifying it under Visigothic rule. He also, unfortunately, initiated a more aggressive policy towards the Jewish population, forcing conversions, a grim precursor to later religious intolerance. This marks a scholarly debate. Was the persecution of Jews an inherent feature of Visigothic rule, or a product of specific kings' policies and the influence of the increasingly powerful Catholic Church? The answer is likely nuanced, reflecting both religious zeal and political expediency. Chindeswinth, another powerful monarch, ruthlessly suppressed aristocratic opposition, executed numerous nobles, and confiscated their lands, all in an effort to centralize power and secure the monarchy. His reign, though authoritarian, brought a period of internal peace that allowed for further legal and administrative reforms, including the final promulgation of the Lex Visigothorum under his son, Receswinthe. These strong kings, however, often created resentment among the powerful nobility, setting the stage for future conflict. It's a classic catch-22. Rule strongly and risk aristocratic rebellion, or rule weakly and risk the collapse of the state. The councils of Toledo continued to play a pivotal role, serving as both religious synods and legislative assemblies. These councils, dominated by the king and the leading bishops, issued decrees on ecclesiastical matters, but also on civil law, royal succession, and public morality. They reflect the unique fusion of church and state in Visigothic Spain, where religious authority was deeply entwined with secular power. The influence of the church grew steadily throughout the 7th century, leading to a society that was deeply pious, but also at times rigidly dogmatic. By the early 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom, for all its achievements, faced a confluence of weakening factors. The chronic problem of royal succession continued, with short reigns and contested enthronements destabilizing the realm. The ruling elite, despite the efforts of kings like Chindaswinthe to centralize power, remained fragmented, with powerful regional magnates often acting semi-independently. Economic prosperity had declined from Roman levels, and the social fabric, though unified under one law, still contained deep-seated tensions, particularly concerning the Jewish minority who faced sporadic persecution. The political infighting reached a critical point with the reign of King Roderick. The circumstances of his ascension are disputed. Some sources suggest he usurped the throne from the sons of his predecessor, King Witiza, creating a powerful faction of disaffected nobles who sought to undermine him. This internal division, a gaping wound in the kingdom's unity, would prove fatal. It's almost as if the kingdom, for all its impressive outward appearance, was suffering from a terminal autoimmune disease. It was into this fragile and internally fractured kingdom that a new, unprecedented external force emerged: the Muslim Umayyad Caliphate from North Africa. Rapidly expanding across the Middle East and North Africa, the Umayyads represented a dynamic and formidable military and religious power, driven by the fervor of Islam. Their armies, composed primarily of Berbers and Arabs, had conquered the Byzantine Exarchate of Africa and were now eyeing the Iberian Peninsula, which lay just across the Strait of Gibraltar. In 711 AD, a relatively small Muslim expeditionary force, led by Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. The traditional narrative, perhaps overly simplistic, claims they were invited by disaffected Visigothic nobles who sought their aid against King Roderick. While this invitation theory is debated, it is clear that the Muslim forces exploited the internal divisions within the Visigothic kingdom. King Roderick hastily gathered an army to confront the invaders, meeting them at the Battle of Guadalete, also known as the Battle of the Barbate River. The details of this battle are shrouded in legend and conflicting accounts, but the outcome was catastrophic for the Visigoths. Roderick was killed, and his army was decisively defeated. This single battle effectively shattered the Visigothic state, opening the floodgates for the rapid Muslim conquest of most of the Iberian Peninsula. It's a shocking end to a kingdom that had endured for centuries, brought down by one decisive and perhaps avoidable defeat. The catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Guadalete in 711 AD marked the precipitous and shocking fall of the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia, a state that had endured for over 2 centuries and seemed, on the surface, to have achieved a degree of stability and cultural synthesis. The Muslim conquest that followed was astonishingly swift, dismantling the Visigothic state within just a few years and ushering in an entirely new era for the peninsula. This rapid collapse is one of the most compelling historical puzzles, prompting continuous scholarly debate on why a seemingly well-established kingdom disintegrated so quickly. It's like watching a seemingly robust building suddenly collapse into a pile of dust. You can't help but wonder what was truly holding it up, or rather, what wasn't. Following the initial victory at Guadalete, the relatively small Muslim forces, led first by Tariq ibn Ziyad and then reinforced by a larger army under Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of North Africa, capitalized on the utter disarray of the Visigothic leadership. With King Roderick dead and no clear successor to rally the remaining forces, organized resistance crumbled. Major Visigothic cities, including Toledo, the capital, Seville, and Merida, fell with surprising ease, often through negotiation or the surrender of their garrisons rather than prolonged sieges. The Muslim advance was less a brutal invasion and more a rapid takeover of a state that had already imploded from within. Several factors contributed to this astonishingly swift collapse. The most immediate was the aforementioned internal divisions within the Visigothic elite. The contested succession of Roderick had created powerful factions who were unwilling to unite against the common enemy, and some may have even welcomed the invaders as a means to settle scores. This lack of a unified command and a divided aristocracy meant that no single leader could effectively mobilize the kingdom's resources for a sustained defense. It's hard to fight an external enemy when you're already fighting yourselves, isn't it? Furthermore, the religious divide within the kingdom, despite Recared's conversion, may have played a role. While the Catholic Church was powerful, the forced conversions of the Jewish population and the lingering resentments from previous Arian Catholic tensions meant that not all segments of the population were fiercely loyal to the Visigothic monarchy. Some scholars argue that certain oppressed groups, particularly the Jews, may have seen the Muslim invaders as potential liberators from Visigothic rule, welcoming them in some areas. The Umayyads, for their part, often offered relatively tolerant terms to dhimmi, protected non-Muslims, who submitted, allowing them to practice their religions in exchange for a special tax. The nature of Visigothic military organization also contributed to the rapid defeat. While the Visigoths had formidable warriors, their military relied heavily on the king's ability to summon the nobility and their retinues. Once the king was defeated and the central authority collapsed, this decentralized military structure proved incapable of mounting a sustained, coordinated defense. There was no professional standing army in the Roman sense to fall back on. Once the personal armies of the nobles were scattered, the kingdom's military capacity evaporated. Within just 7 years, by 718 AD, the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula, stretching from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Pyrenees, was under Muslim control. Only a few small, isolated pockets of Christian resistance remained in the mountainous regions of the far north, particularly in Asturias. These tiny enclaves, seemingly insignificant at the time, would prove to be the seeds of the later Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian effort to reclaim the peninsula. It's a classic example of how even in total defeat, tiny embers of resistance can survive and eventually rekindle. The legacy of the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia did not simply vanish with the Muslim conquest. Much of its administrative and legal framework persisted, particularly the Lex Visigothorum. The Muslim conquerors, in many areas, found it pragmatic to allow local populations to continue using their existing laws and customs, especially in civil matters. This meant that elements of Visigothic law continued to influence legal practice in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, for centuries, and even later, as the Christian kingdoms of the north began their reconquest, they often adopted and adapted elements of the Visigothic code, viewing it as the legitimate law of the land. This continued influence of the Visigothic code on medieval Spanish law is a key historiographical point, demonstrating that legal traditions can outlive the states that create them. The rapid fall of the Visigothic kingdom stands in stark contrast to the drawn-out decline of the Western Roman Empire. While the Roman Empire was slowly eroded over centuries by a multitude of internal and external pressures, the Visigothic state, despite its strengths, simply fractured and collapsed in the face of a unified, determined, and militarily superior invading force. It's a powerful reminder that even seemingly stable polities can be undone by a critical combination of internal weakness and external threat. The end of the Visigothic kingdom marked the close of one chapter of Gothic history and the opening of another, radically different, one for the Iberian Peninsula. While the Visigothic political entity in Iberia met its dramatic end with the Muslim conquest, the cultural and legal legacy of the Visigoths proved remarkably enduring, weaving itself into the very fabric of subsequent Spanish history. Their nearly 3 centuries of rule left an indelible mark on the peninsula, shaping institutions, legal traditions, and even aspects of identity that would persist through the centuries of Al-Andalus and the Christian Reconquista. It's a subtle kind of persistence, isn't it, where the outward forms of power may vanish, but the deeper currents of culture continue to flow, shaping what comes next. Perhaps the most significant and long-lasting contribution of the Visigothic kingdom to Spain was the Lex Visigothorum, or the Visigothic Code. As discussed, this comprehensive legal framework was unique in its application to all subjects, Goths and Romans alike, establishing a principle of territorial law rather than personal law. Even after the Muslim conquest, this code did not simply disappear. In many areas of Muslim-controlled Al-Andalus, especially where the Christian population remained significant, the local legal traditions, largely based on the Visigothic code, continued to be applied, particularly in matters of civil law and family disputes. The Muslim rulers, pragmatic in their governance, often allowed local customs to persist, finding it more expedient than imposing an entirely new legal system on a conquered populace. Even more profoundly, as the Christian kingdoms of the north began their slow and arduous process of reconquista, they often looked to the Visigothic code as the legitimate legal heritage of the land. This wasn't merely a nostalgic gesture. It was a practical recognition of a pre-existing sophisticated body of law that could be adapted to govern newly reclaimed territories. For example, the Fuero Juzgo, a medieval Castilian legal code, was essentially a translation and adaptation of the Lex Visigothorum. This direct lineage meant that Visigothic legal principles concerning property, marriage, contracts, and even criminal justice continued to influence Spanish law for centuries, profoundly shaping the legal systems that would eventually underpin a unified Spain. Imagine a legal document from over 1,000 years ago still having a tangible impact on modern legal frameworks. It's a testament to its foresight and adaptability, isn't it? Beyond law, the Visigothic period also saw the development of a distinct Hispano-Visigothic artistic and architectural style. While much of their monumental architecture was later destroyed or repurposed, archaeological excavations and surviving fragments reveal a style that blended late Roman traditions with Germanic influences and early Christian iconography. Examples include the horseshoe arch, which, though present in earlier Roman and Syrian architecture, became a defining characteristic of Visigothic ecclesiastical buildings before its widespread adoption and elaboration in Islamic architecture in Al-Andalus. The churches of San Pedro de la Nave and Santa Comba de Bande, for instance, showcase unique Visigothic architectural elements, though their precise dating and influences are still subjects of scholarly debate. This architectural continuity, often subtly woven into later Islamic and Christian structures, represents another enduring, if sometimes hidden, legacy. The close relationship between the Visigothic monarchy and the Catholic Church, particularly evident in the councils of Toledo, also left a profound mark. These councils had established a tradition of the Church playing a significant role in political affairs, advising the king and even influencing royal succession. This model of a strong, often intertwined church and state continued to be a powerful precedent for the nascent Christian kingdoms of the Reconquista. The idea of a Christian king ruling with the divine sanction and active participation of the clergy became deeply ingrained in the Spanish political tradition, a direct inheritance from the Visigothic era. It's almost as if the clergy became the ultimate political consultants, advising on everything from laws to who should be king. The very concept of a unified Spain itself, even if only ideologically, arguably has roots in the Visigothic period. While not a modern nation-state, the Visigothic kings were the first to effectively unify the entire peninsula under a single political authority. After conquering the Suebi and expelling the Byzantines, this created a sense of a distinct Iberian political entity, separate from other European powers, and provided a historical precedent for later efforts at peninsular unification. The idea of Hispania as a singular realm, rather than a collection of Roman provinces, gained traction under Visigothic rule. One intriguing historiographic mystery that persists relates to the extent of Romanization versus Gothicization within Visigothic society. While the Visigothic elite adopted Latin and Roman legal practices, how much did the Hispano-Romans adopt Gothic customs or integrate with their conquerors? The archaeological record suggests a gradual blurring of lines, particularly after the conversion to Catholicism, but the degree of true fusion remains a subject of academic discussion. Was it a genuine melting pot, or more of a layered cake with distinct but interacting strata? The answer likely varies by region and social class, adding nuance to our understanding of this complex period. Ultimately, the Muslim conquest, while bringing an end to the Visigothic dynasty, did not erase their presence from the historical narrative. Instead, it transformed their legacy, allowing it to subtly influence the subsequent centuries of Iberian history. The Visigothic period laid crucial groundwork, providing legal foundations, architectural motifs, and political precedents that would be selectively adopted, adapted, and remembered by those who came after, ensuring that the Goths, though no longer holding the reins of power, continued to shape the destiny of Spain. Beyond their direct political and legal impact on the Iberian Peninsula, the Goths left behind a profound, if largely fragmented, linguistic legacy: the Gothic language. This ancient Germanic tongue holds a unique and invaluable place in the study of Indo-European languages, not just because it was the language of a major barbarian power, but because it is the earliest Germanic language for which we possess extensive written records. The very existence of these records is a direct consequence of a monumental religious and scholarly endeavor undertaken by one extraordinary individual, Bishop Ulfilas. Ulfilas, whose name itself is a Latinized form of a Gothic name meaning little wolf, lived in the 4th century AD, Tsayui, 311-383 AD. He was a Goth, but had a Roman lineage and was educated in Constantinople. Crucially, he became a bishop in the Arian Christian tradition, a theological branch that held a distinct view on the nature of Christ, differing from the Nicene Christianity adopted by the later Roman Empire. Ulfilas's most significant achievement was his mission to convert the Goths to Christianity, and to facilitate this, he undertook the colossal task of translating the Bible from Greek into Gothic. Imagine the sheer dedication and intellectual prowess required to translate such a massive and complex text into a language that, at that time, had no written form. It's a bit like deciding to translate Shakespeare into a new language you're inventing as you go along, isn't it? To accomplish this, Ulfilas did something truly revolutionary. He created the Gothic alphabet. This alphabet was not simply an adoption of Latin or Greek script. It was a unique invention, likely drawing inspiration from Greek, Latin, and possibly some older runic symbols, but adapted specifically to capture the sounds of Gothic. This custom-designed script allowed for the faithful transcription of the Bible, making it accessible to the newly converted Gothic people. The surviving portions of Ulfilas's translation, particularly the magnificent Codex Argentius, the Silver Book, are the cornerstone of our knowledge of the Gothic language. This codex, written in silver and gold ink on purple-dyed parchment, is not just a linguistic treasure, but also a stunning work of art, reflecting the high cultural aspirations even of this early Gothic period. The Codex Argentius contains large parts of the 4 Gospels and is an exquisite example of manuscript illumination. Its survival is something of a miracle, having traveled through various hands and locations over the centuries, finally resting in Uppsala, Sweden. Its preservation allows modern linguists to reconstruct much of the Gothic language, providing critical insights into the development of other Germanic languages, including English, German, and Norse. For historical linguists, Gothic is a Rosetta Stone, offering a glimpse into the earlier stages of a major language family that would otherwise be lost to the mists of time. However, despite Ulfilas's monumental efforts, the Gothic language eventually faded. As the Visigoths settled in Gaul and then Hispania, and the Ostrogoths in Italy, they increasingly adopted Latin, the language of the Roman majority, and the administrative language of the lands they conquered. This process of linguistic assimilation was gradual but inexorable. The Gothic language ceased to be spoken in daily life, especially after the conversion to Nicene Catholicism, which removed one of the key reasons for maintaining a distinct Gothic Bible and liturgy. By the 8th century, with the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, Gothic had largely vanished as a spoken language, leaving behind only the precious fragments of Ulfilas's translation and a few scattered inscriptions. It's a sad irony that the language of such a powerful people, once so vibrant, is now primarily known to a handful of dedicated scholars. One intriguing historiographic mystery concerns the exact extent to which Gothic was spoken in the Visigothic kingdom during its later centuries. Was it confined to a small aristocratic elite, or did pockets of it persist among the general Gothic population, particularly in rural areas? While most scholars agree on its eventual decline, the precise timeline and geographical distribution of its usage remain open to debate, dependent on sparse and indirect evidence. The survival of a few isolated Gothic phrases and names in later Latin documents suggests that elements persisted. But clearly, the tide had turned decisively towards Latin. The study of Gothic also offers insights into the religious and cultural life of the early Goths. The specific vocabulary chosen by Ulfilas for theological concepts reflects the particularities of Arian theology and how new Christian ideas were translated into a Germanic worldview. For instance, the Gothic word for Lord, Gothic Frauja, and other terms reveal an attempt to adapt existing concepts rather than simply borrowing Latin words, showing the active intellectual engagement of the translators. This linguistic window into their religious thought is invaluable. The decline of Gothic is a common tale in the history of conquering peoples who settle among a larger, culturally dominant population. The prestige and utility of Latin as the language of administration, law, and a more sophisticated literary tradition ultimately proved irresistible, while the Goths left a significant imprint on the political landscape of Europe. Their distinct language became an early casualty of their integration into the post-Roman world, surviving now primarily in the hallowed pages of the Codex Argenteus, a silent echo of a once mighty tongue. While written records of the Goths are largely limited to the perspectives of Roman and Byzantine historians, often colored by bias or limited understanding, a significant portion of our knowledge about their daily lives, material culture, and social structures comes from the silent, yet eloquent, language of archaeological discoveries. These unearthed fragments, from burial sites to settlement remains, provide invaluable, tangible evidence that complements and sometimes challenges the written accounts, allowing us a more intimate glimpse into the Gothic world beyond the battlefields and royal courts. It's like finding old family photographs that fill in the gaps of a written biography, adding texture and reality to the narrative. One of the most crucial areas of archaeological focus for understanding the Goths has been their burial practices. Early Gothic graves, particularly those associated with the Wielbach culture in present-day Poland, reveal distinctive characteristics, such as the practice of cremation alongside inhumation, and a relative scarcity of weapons in male graves compared to other Germanic cultures. This has led to scholarly debates about whether these early Goths were less militaristic or simply had different funerary customs that emphasized other aspects of identity. Later Gothic burials, especially from the Ostrogothic and Visigothic periods in Italy and Spain, show a gradual adoption of Roman burial customs, moving towards inhumation in sarcophagi and the inclusion of Roman artifacts alongside traditional Gothic jewelry. This evolution in burial practices is a subtle but clear indicator of their ongoing cultural assimilation and interaction with Roman society. Another significant area of discovery involves settlement archaeology. While the Goths were often portrayed as constantly on the move, their periods of settlement, particularly in Dacia, before their major migrations, and later in Aquitaine, Italy, and Hispania, have revealed much about their domestic life. Excavations have uncovered traces of their dwellings, farming implements, and daily pottery. These sites often show a mix of Roman and Germanic building techniques and material culture, suggesting a fluid exchange of ideas and technologies rather than a rigid separation. For instance, the discovery of Visigothic settlements in Spain often shows them living in proximity to, or even within, former Roman urban centers, utilizing existing infrastructure while also developing their own distinct communities. It's a wonderful kind of detective work, isn't it? Piecing together an entire way of life from scattered stones and broken pots. Gothic craftsmanship and artistry are also illuminated through archaeological finds. Distinctive forms of jewelry, particularly fibulae, brooches, adorned with intricate cloisonné work using gold and semi-precious stones, have been unearthed in numerous Gothic graves and hoards. These pieces are not merely decorative. They are often rich in symbolic meaning, reflecting Gothic aesthetic preferences and technological skill. The famous Visigothic votive crowns from Guarazar, found in Spain, are perhaps the most spectacular examples, showcasing exquisite goldwork and indicating the wealth and piety of the later Visigothic monarchy. These crowns, though ceremonial, demonstrate a sophisticated artistic tradition that blended Roman influences with a unique Gothic flair. The recovery of coinage is also vital for understanding Gothic kingdoms. Visigothic and Ostrogothic coins, particularly gold tremises, small gold coins, provide crucial evidence for their economic systems, trade networks, and even their political messaging. The changing iconography on these coins, from initial imitations of Roman imperial issues to later distinct Gothic designs, reflects their gradual assertion of independence and their evolving self-perception as legitimate rulers. The presence of these coins throughout their territories indicates organized economies and a degree of administrative control. However, a recurring theme in Gothic archaeology is the difficulty in definitively identifying Gothic sites or artifacts. Because the Goths were a mobile people who often absorbed and were absorbed by other cultures, and because their material culture often showed strong Roman influences. Distinguishing purely Gothic remains from those of Romanized populations or other Germanic groups can be a significant challenge. This historiographic mystery forces archaeologists to rely on careful contextual analysis, examining burial customs, architectural styles, and artifact assemblages to draw conclusions about ethnic identity and cultural interaction. It's not as simple as finding a sign that says Gothic was here. This ambiguity is part of the ongoing debate about the very nature of Gothic identity itself. Was it primarily ethnic, or more a fluid political and cultural affiliation? Recent advances in archaeogenetics and isotopic analysis, the study of chemical signatures in human remains, are beginning to add fascinating new layers to these archaeological investigations. By analyzing ancient DNA and bone chemistry, researchers are starting to trace migration patterns, dietary habits, and even kinship ties within ancient populations, potentially offering new insights into the mobility and genetic makeup of the Goths. This interdisciplinary approach promises to resolve some long-standing questions, while undoubtedly raising new ones about who the Goths were and how they interacted with the diverse peoples of late antiquity. These scientific tools are bringing us closer to understanding the lived experiences of these ancient people, moving beyond the grand narratives of kings and battles to the everyday realities of life and death. The story of the Goths, despite its chronological progression, is far from a settled narrative, remaining a vibrant arena of historiographical debates and scholarly controversies. From their elusive origins to the precise reasons for their successes and failures, historians constantly re-examine textual evidence, archaeological findings, and linguistic clues, offering competing interpretations that enrich our understanding of this pivotal period in European history. It's a bit like a perpetual academic detective story, with new clues emerging and old theories being rigorously tested, keeping the past alive in the present. One of the most enduring and fundamental debates revolves around the very origins of the Goths and their early migrations. While Jordanes' Getica provides a narrative linking them to Scandinavia, modern scholarship often treats this account with considerable skepticism. Was it a genuine historical memory, perhaps embellished, or a constructed myth designed to provide the Goths with a prestigious ancient lineage? Archaeological evidence from the Wheelbark culture sometimes seems to contradict the idea of a mass migration from Scandinavia, suggesting a more complex, gradual process of ethnogenesis, the formation of a distinct ethnic identity through the interaction of various groups. This debate challenges us to think critically about how ancient peoples understood their own past and how those narratives were shaped by later political needs. Another significant area of contention concerns the nature of Gothic identity itself. Were the Goths a cohesive people or nation throughout their long history? Or were they a more fluid, multi-ethnic confederation that adopted the Gothic name as a political or military affiliation? The term Gothic in Roman sources often seems to be applied broadly, encompassing various Germanic and even non-Germanic groups who fought alongside or under Gothic leaders. This idea of ethnogenesis, where identity is dynamic and constructed rather than fixed and immutable, is a powerful tool for understanding barbarian groups. It suggests that individuals and groups could become Gothic by adopting certain customs, military practices, or political loyalties, rather than solely through biological descent. It's like how a sports team gains new members who then become part of the team's identity, even if they weren't there from the very beginning. The fall of the Western Roman Empire and the role of the Goths within it also generate extensive debate. Were the Goths primarily destroyers of the Roman Empire? Or were they, as some argue, accidental inheritors, trying to preserve aspects of Roman civilization while establishing their own kingdoms? Theodoric the Great's reign in Italy certainly leans towards the latter, showcasing an ambition to maintain Roman institutions. However, the sack of Rome by Alaric, while not as destructive as often portrayed, undeniably symbolized the empire's vulnerability. Historians grapple with whether the Visigoths and Ostrogoths consciously aimed to replace Rome, or simply sought to secure their own survival and prosperity within its declining framework. The mechanisms of settlement and coexistence between Goths and Romans in the successor kingdoms are also a rich source of scholarly disagreement. How exactly did the Visigoths take land in Aquitaine and Hispania? Was it a formal division, a system of hospitality, or a gradual informal encroachment? And how did the two populations, with their distinct legal traditions and for a time differing religions, interact on a daily basis? While the Lex Visigothorum demonstrates a desire for legal unity, the social realities were likely more complex and varied by region. Understanding these subtleties is crucial for moving beyond simplistic narratives of conqueror and conquered. The conversion of the Visigoths to Nicene Catholicism under Recared, as discussed earlier, is another point of fascinating debate. Was it a genuine spiritual awakening, or a pragmatic political calculation aimed at unifying the kingdom and securing the support of the Hispano-Roman majority and the Catholic Church? While the immediate political benefits are undeniable, the internal religious tensions leading up to the conversion suggest a deeper, more complex set of motivations. It challenges us to consider the interplay of personal belief and political necessity in the actions of historical figures. Finally, the reasons for the rapid collapse of the Visigothic kingdom in 711 AD with the Muslim conquest remain a hotly contested topic. Was it primarily due to internal weaknesses, such as the fractured nobility, the problematic elective monarchy, and the religious tensions with the Jewish population? Or was it the sheer military superiority and religious zeal of the invading Umayyad forces? Most scholars now agree that it was a combination of factors, with internal divisions providing a critical vulnerability that the invaders skillfully exploited. This particular debate serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of internal strife in the face of external threats. These ongoing debates are not merely academic exercises. They reflect a deeper effort to understand the complexities of cultural contact, identity formation, and state building in a period of profound transformation. By constantly questioning and re-evaluating the evidence, historians continue to bring the Goths to life, reminding us that the past is never truly static, but a living dialogue between what we know and what we are still trying to understand. It's comforting, in a way, to know that even after all this time, there are still mysteries to unravel and new insights to be discovered. Beyond the scholarly debates and the dusty archaeological digs, the Goths, or at least the idea of them, have exerted a surprisingly powerful and persistent influence on arts, literature, and popular culture, often in ways that bear little resemblance to their historical reality. This Gothic revival, a fascinating example of how history is reinterpreted and reimagined over time, began centuries after their kingdoms had fallen, transforming their name from that of a historical people into a descriptive term for a specific aesthetic. It's a curious journey, isn't it? From being actual people who built kingdoms to becoming an adjective that conjures images of gloom and grandeur. The first significant cultural Gothic moment arrived in the High Middle Ages with the emergence of Gothic architecture. This style, characterized by its soaring pointed arches, ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and expansive stained glass windows, emerged in 12th century France and spread rapidly across Europe, creating magnificent cathedrals that reached ever skyward. Ironically, the Goths themselves had absolutely nothing to do with this architectural innovation. The term Gothic was originally used as a pejorative by Italian Renaissance critics, who viewed the medieval style as barbaric and crude, associating it with the destructive Goths, who had, in their view, brought about the end of classical Roman civilization. They saw it as a regression from the perceived perfection of Roman and Greek art, a rude Gothic interruption. So the very name for this beautiful, intricate architecture was, in essence, an insult, a historical misnomer that stuck. It's a bit like calling a delicious dish terrible food, and the name somehow sticks for centuries. Centuries later, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Gothic found a new, even more potent life in the realm of literature and art. This was the era of the Gothic revival in architecture and the birth of Gothic literature. Figures like Horace Walpole, with his novel The Castle of Otranto, 1764, pioneered a new literary genre focused on mystery, horror, the supernatural, crumbling castles, ancient curses, and tortured aristocratic protagonists. This Gothic novel became immensely popular, setting the stage for later works like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula. The historical Goths had no vampires or haunted castles, of course, but the term lent an air of ancient, dark mystery that perfectly suited the genre's themes. The connection was purely atmospheric, evoking a sense of ancient, wild Europe. This literary movement often coincided with a fascination for medievalism and a romanticized view of the Dark Ages. Artists and writers looked back to this period, not with the disdain of the Renaissance, but with a sense of awe and a desire to explore the sublime, that unsettling beauty found in wildness, ruin, and terror. The Gothic became synonymous with the antiquated, the melancholic, the supernatural, and the darkly romantic. It was a complete rebranding, taking a historical name and infusing it with an entirely new set of emotional and aesthetic associations. In the 20th century, the cultural echoes of Gothic continued to reverberate, taking on new forms. The dark romanticism of Gothic literature evolved into modern Gothic horror in film and popular fiction. Think of the brooding atmosphere, the sense of dread, and the morally ambiguous characters that characterize many horror films and novels. The aesthetic also found its way into fashion and subculture, notably the goth subculture that emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s, influenced by punk rock and post-punk music. This subculture embraced a distinct style of dress, dark clothing, elaborate makeup, Victorian influences, and an appreciation for themes of melancholy, romanticism, and the macabre. Here, the Gothic has become an identity, a way of expressing a particular sensibility that still carries the faint, distorted echoes of its distant historical namesake. One of the interesting aspects of this cultural phenomenon is the complete divorce between the historical reality of the Goths and their popular cultural image. The actual Goths were farmers, warriors, administrators, and craftsmen who built kingdoms, adopted Roman institutions, and converted to Christianity, albeit Arian initially. They were not inherently dark, mysterious, or obsessed with death and gloom, yet the enduring power of the Gothic aesthetic speaks to how historical terms can take on a life of their own, evolving far beyond their original meanings and tapping into deeper human fascinations with mystery, ruin, and the uncanny. This disconnect presents a fun challenge for historians. How do you reconcile the historical truth with the pervasive popular image? It's a bit like explaining that Frankenstein's monster wasn't actually named Frankenstein, but the name is just too ingrained to change. The cultural appropriation of the Gothic name highlights how collective memory and popular imagination can reshape historical figures and periods to suit contemporary anxieties, romantic ideals, or artistic expressions. It serves as a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts, but also a reservoir of symbols and archetypes that different eras draw upon and reinterpret. So the next time you see a Gothic cathedral, read a Gothic novel, or encounter someone with a Gothic style, remember that the threads of meaning stretch back to a fierce and influential people. But the aesthetic you're experiencing is a layered invention of centuries of imaginative reinvention. Having journeyed through their migrations, conflicts, and the rise and fall of their kingdoms, we arrive at the enduring echo of the Goths, their multifaceted legacy that continues to resonate, often subtly, in our modern world. It's a legacy far more complex than the simple, often negative connotations of Gothic as barbarian or destructive. Instead, the Goths represent a powerful case study in the dynamics of cultural exchange, the formation of new identities, and the intricate process by which the ancient world transitioned into the medieval. Their story reminds us that history is rarely a simple narrative of good versus evil, or conqueror versus conquered, but a continuous interplay of adaptation, innovation, and perseverance. Perhaps the most significant aspect of the Gothic legacy lies in their role as transitional figures between the classical Roman world and the nascent medieval kingdoms of Europe. They were not merely agents of destruction. They were also active participants in the creation of a new order. The Visigoths in Spain, with their unified legal code and their eventual conversion to Catholicism, demonstrate a remarkable capacity for state building and cultural synthesis. Theodoric the Great's Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, for its brief, brilliant period, stands as a testament to the potential for a sophisticated Romano-Germanic coexistence. These weren't simply groups burning down what came before. They were, in their own way, attempting to build something new, often upon the very foundations of Roman institutions. It's a profound shift in perspective, isn't it? From seeing them as simply breaking things to seeing them as reluctant or perhaps ambitious builders. The very concept of a distinct European identity emerging from the ashes of the Western Roman Empire owes a subtle debt to the interactions between the Goths and the Romans. These were the first large-scale encounters where a barbarian people not only settled within Roman territory, but also took on significant roles in governance and defense. The resulting cultural hybridity, evident in their laws, art, and even their language through the adoption of Latin, contributed to the diverse tapestry of medieval Europe, laying some of the groundwork for the future nation-states that would eventually emerge. The Goths, in their quest for a homeland, inadvertently helped define the shifting boundaries and identities of a new continent. Their impact on legal history is particularly profound. The Lex Visigothorum, with its revolutionary principle of territorial law applied to all inhabitants, was a landmark achievement. This code influenced later legal developments in Spain and beyond, showcasing a sophisticated approach to justice that recognized the need for a unified legal framework in a multi-ethnic society. It stands as a testament to the administrative capabilities of the Visigothic monarchy and their commitment to legal order, a legacy that often goes unacknowledged in popular historical narratives. It's comforting to think that the concept of a single law for all people has such ancient roots, even if it took a long time to truly become widespread. Moreover, the Goths contributed to the religious landscape of Europe. Their initial adherence to Arian Christianity and the monumental effort of Ulfilas to translate the Bible into Gothic shaped the early Christianization of various Germanic tribes. While Arianism eventually faded in the West with the Visigothic conversion to Nicene Catholicism, this period of theological debate and distinct religious identity is a crucial part of Christian history, highlighting the diversity of early Christian thought. The councils of Toledo, deeply intertwined with the Visigothic monarchy, established precedents for the role of the Church in state affairs that would resonate through the medieval period in Spain. The misapplication of the term Gothic to medieval architecture or later literary movements also offers a fascinating insight into the power of language and cultural reinterpretation. It demonstrates how historical names can become detached from their original contexts and acquire new layers of meaning, often reflecting later societal anxieties or aesthetic preferences. This Gothic branding, though historically inaccurate, has ensured that the name of this ancient people, however distorted, remains a part of our modern lexicon and cultural consciousness. It's a testament to the enduring human fascination with the past, even when that fascination leads to a somewhat imaginative retelling. Ultimately, the story of the Goths is a vivid reminder that history is not a static collection of facts, but a dynamic and often messy process of human interaction, migration, and transformation. They were not monolithic. They were a complex, adaptable people who, driven by circumstance and ambition, left their mark on the very foundations of Europe, from their debated origins to their final absorption into other cultures. Their journey illustrates the ebb and flow of power, the resilience of identity, and the surprising ways in which seemingly disparate threads weave together to form the intricate tapestry of our shared past. Their legacy, a blend of destruction and creation, barbarism and sophistication, continues to invite reflection on the enduring question of how civilizations rise, fall, and contribute to what comes next.